Recording now. All right, our topic today is indoor air quality for HVAC systems. This is one of three topics I'm going to be doing with y'all the next 3 weeks. This one's kind of a standalone thing. And then the next 2 weeks after this is energy efficiency for packaged systems. And that'll be a part 1 and a part 2 type deal. If you guys have any questions today, assuming you're watching the live version and not the recorded version, if you have any questions today, put them in the question chat box, and I will do my best to answer any of those that come up. And then my email is on the screen right now. If you think of a question, 3 days from now or whatever, and you want to send it to me, go ahead and do that. You'll probably get responses back from me at night because I teach all day. But I will get back to you the best that I can. So in regards to our topic today, we're going to focus on indoor air quality. Obviously, COVID-19 is a big part of that discussion the past year, so we'll incorporate that into here. But we're not going to just focus on that because that's just, that's just a this year thing, or rather a last year thing, hopefully. But we're going to talk about all kinds of different viruses and bacteria and other things in buildings that we need to deal with. So we'll talk about everything simultaneously. I would like to thank the folks over at the, well, my clicking's not working here. There we go. Thank the folks over at the Massachusetts Energy Efficiency Partnership. They put this event together along with their utility sponsors. So thank them when you see them for helping get this happening and getting this type of education out there. It's just not me. There's other people out there doing training for them too this year. We need to get as much education out there as we can, and a lot of that's going to be remote like we're doing today. Here's our agenda for today. We're going to go through various types of indoor air quality pollutants. And discuss what kinds of things we need to deal with in the air. We'll talk about the different ways to deal with that with a pretty good focus on ventilation. That's a long time successful solution. And then we'll talk about all kinds of other stuff: filtration, air purifiers, ionizers, duct sealing, all kinds of stuff like that we'll touch on today. And we'll do it both from a SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 focus, as well as other more traditional pollutants that we'll deal with. We'll cover them all. So in regards to indoor air quality in general, there are 3 types of things that we will generally find in the air that we do not want to have in the air. We have particulates, microbials, and gases. And we can look at each one of those things separately. So particulates are chunks of debris in the air, things that I don't want floating around in the air that are fairly measurable things, right? Smaller than stuff that I would normally think about, but big enough that I could actually physically see them. So those kind of dump into 3 buckets of their own, sort of cleanly. The first one is dust. And if you didn't know, dust is primarily made of human skin cells, which is kind of gross in itself. So if your house is dusty, it's pretty much just covered in pieces of you. So we want to deal with that. We don't want that floating around. It just looks gross. Then we have dander, which is the stuff coming off of your pets, your cats and dogs and so forth. And some people can be allergic to dander. So if people have, cat allergies and pet allergies, it can be an issue. Now in commercial buildings like we're talking about today, typically don't deal much with dander unless it happens to be like a pet shop or something like that. And then we have pollen, which is stuff coming off of the plants. There could be a few indoor plants in your building, but generally most of the pollen is coming from the outdoors. Right? The seasonal allergies that some of your coworkers and employees have, that's the kind of stuff we're dealing with. So we have dust, which is people debris, dander, which is animal debris, and pollen, which is plant debris. That is the large portion of particulates we have in the air. There are other particulates too, and we'll deal with those, but these are the big ones. In general, each person is sucking in about 2 tablespoons of those particulates every day, and your nose hairs and your lungs become the filtering system for that. What we'd love to do is have something else filter that. Why would you want to be the filter when I can have something else take care of that, specifically at your HVAC equipment? The second category of pollutants in a building that we want to deal with is microbials. And this will obviously be one of the bigger focuses of discussion. Microbials also break up into 3 subcategories. We have bacteria. And I know that there is good and there's bad bacteria, right? In your stomach, you have the good bacteria breaking down food and stuff like that. But we're not concerned with that. We're concerned with the bad bacteria, and specifically the bacteria floating around your building. So, for example, strep throat is caused by a bacteria. So if you get strep throat from your kid or from your coworker or whatever it is, that's a bacterial infection. All right, so that's the bad bacteria. There's other stuff out there too, not just strep throat, obviously, staph infections. If you deal with restaurants, E. coli is a topic, right? Hospitals, maybe MRSA. There's different bacterial infections out there that we might have to deal with. We'd like to get rid of as much of that as possible. We'd like to have that not be on our surfaces, not on our countertops, not on our doorknobs, not in our airflow. Get rid of all that stuff. So there's good and bad bacteria. We're mainly concerned with the bad bacteria, but we're going to have to be an equal opportunity killer. We're not going to have the ability to only kill bad bacteria, not good bacteria. So any bacteria in the space we're going to get rid of. Viruses are a big concern. There's no good viruses. I mean, you could probably make an argument there's some functional, large-scale purpose that viruses exist in the universe. But as far as my health is concerned, I'd rather there be no viruses in my office. So obviously, the biggest ones there are influenza and the common cold. Those are the two big players that we've had for decades and decades and decades that we don't want to have. Those are the ones that, wipe out our kids at school and at work, and then people are out for 3 days. And then obviously SARS-CoV-2 is a new topic in the past year. That is a virus as well, so we're going to treat that as such. And there's plenty of other ones over the years, H1N1, avian bird flu, SARS, norovirus, all kinds of things like that that could be in the space that we want to get rid of. And that third category of microbials would be mold, fungus specifically. So there's good and bad molds as well, just like there was with bacteria, right? So if you didn't know it, penicillin comes from mold, right? And that's obviously beneficial. Blue cheese has a mold component, right? So there are molds that are not harmful to us, but we're not concerned about those. We're concerned about the bad ones, the black mold, the things that could be growing behind the walls of your building that you don't really want growing behind the walls of your building. So that's a picture of my house where I grew up. It's the reason that I am only 5'9". Because of the bad air quality, I'd never achieved my 6'10" status that I was hoping for. No, I'm just kidding. This is just like the worst picture I could possibly Google of the grossest looking ceiling at a house. So mold needs three things to thrive, to grow and thrive, right? So we need to have mold spores to start off with, and there's millions of them in the air sitting in the room that you're in, so there's plenty of mold spores available. So those are going to be pretty hard to get rid of. We'll try, but they're going to be hard to get rid of. Mold needs to have a food source, so it has to have something organic to eat, pretty much anything organic. It could be the proverbial bread on the counter. It could be an orange. It could be wood. It could be the paper inside your drywall. Like anything that was ever made out of a plant, like wood, would be something that it could eat. So it's going to be really hard to get rid of that unless you make your entire building out of stainless steel, like a prison cell, which would be pretty drab. And then the third thing that we absolutely have to have for mold to grow is some moisture or water. Now, in the case of this house example, it's pretty obvious to me that this moldy ceiling has to have a water leak in the roof, because the whole entire ceiling is covered, not just one spot. And you can almost see on this back wall, it's almost like it's like flowing downward with gravity to wherever it can leak its way through. So my guess is it's a roof leak that's been unattended to for a couple of years, and that's why it ended up getting so bad. If I just had it in one spot, then I'd be more likely to think maybe it's like a pipe leak or something, right? So water leaking in from the outdoors is one way to have mold. Water leaking from a pipe, either a hydronic pipe or a domestic water pipe, or it could be sucking water vapor out of the air. And that's the main one we're going to deal with today. Obviously, if you have a roof leak, fix your roof leak. If you got a pipe leak, fix your pipe leak. If it's too humid inside your space, how are we going to fix that? Right? We're going to have to find a way to deal with that. So we're going to have to dehumidify the space better than we otherwise would. For you guys that want to know more about dehumidifying, let me know. I can send you like a whole 1-hour webinar on that. Pretty much most, unless you're like in Florida, which none of you guys are. You guys are all in the Northeast and a few of you from the Midwest, I think. But unless you're like in Florida or somewhere like nasty humid, other than that, the humidity, the high humidity in your space is probably being caused by the lack of dehumidification from your standard air conditioning system. And there's numerous reasons for that. But in order for your air conditioner to dehumidify, it has to be on and running. When it first kicks on, this is at your office, this is at a school, this is at your house, anything's the same. When it first kicks on, it starts the compressor up, we start dropping the temperature of the indoor air going through the evaporator coil, and there's no moisture being removed at the beginning. It takes 3, 4, 5 minutes for us to get that coil down to the dew point of the air, and then we can start condensing and pulling moisture out. Right? The dew point is when condensation forms. Just like in the morning, you have condensation on the windshield of your truck or whatever. Right? So, but if I have oversized equipment, it turns on, it satisfies the thermostat in 5 minutes, which means I only got like 1 minute of dehumidification. I need that air conditioner to run 15, 20, 30 minutes at a crack. It should run nonstop. That will give me the most dehumidification. And if I oversize the equipment, it doesn't run very long, which is horrible. So big equipment is a problem. It's the #1 problem in the HVAC industry. And none of the HVAC folks will believe me on that. So I have an entire 1-hour webinar just on that oversizing problem and what it does for dehumidification. If you need that information, send me a note. I'll put my email up again at the end of today. Send me a note and I'll get you that link. So we're dealing with those microbials, viruses, bacteria, and mold. Technically, bacteria and mold are living, so that hence we can kill them. Viruses are technically not alive because a virus needs to have a host to survive. So every time I say I'm going to kill a virus, all the the biologist people get all mad at me. The doctors get all mad at me saying, "Oh, you can't kill a virus. It was never alive." Okay, I get it. I believe you. But I'm still going to say kill a virus because it just sounds better. So I'm going to kill bacteria. I'm going to kill viruses, at least conceptually, and then I'm going to kill the mold in the space. This stuff's growing and replicating pretty quickly, so I'm going to have to keep up pretty aggressively to have a chance to deal with this. If I don't keep up with my provisions, filtration, ventilation, air purification, this stuff can grow pretty rapidly. The third category of stuff we're going to deal with is gases, right? So we had the particulates, chunks of stuff in the air, microbial, the living pollutants, and then I have gases. Gases are one of the hardest to deal with because it's very difficult to say filter a gas out because a gas is the same size as air molecules approximately. And if I block all the air molecules on the filter, that's going to be a problem. I can't move air through the building. So filtering gases can be a challenge, and we're going to talk about ways to deal with that other than filtration. There are 2 types of gases that we're mostly concerned with in commercial buildings. I wish there was 3 things on here because I had a nice like 3-3-3 pattern going, but it's only really 2 major things here. One is VOCs, volatile organic compounds. This is the off-gassing of all types of things in your building. So unless you've specifically bought low or no VOC paints and adhesives and stuff, unless you've done that, which is not very common, and you bought just standard things, you're going to have tons of VOCs. Right? When you buy a brand new car and it has that new car smell, guess what that is? VOCs. It's not good for you to breathe, but I mean, you got a new car, you're all excited, so obviously you love the smell. Whatever this desk is made out of, some kind of pressed wood, I'm sure there's glues and adhesives in it, that's giving off VOCs. Whatever varnish they used on my desk, giving off VOCs. Whatever paint's on that wall behind me, giving off VOCs. Now, over time, they give off less and less and less, right? There's a half-life discussion to them. But when they're first brand new, there's tons of VOCs. The cleaning agents, the things we are scrubbing down desks with, right? The Lysol sprays and all that, they all have VOCs, right? So I want to get rid of all that stuff out of the space. I'm not going to really be able to filter it, so I'm going to have to dilute it with fresh air, which we'll talk about here in a second. Or I'm going to have to break it down with a purifier. The second category of stuff that we're mainly concerned with in buildings is odors. Odors are generally speaking not harmful to you. You just don't want to smell them. They're just not good, right? So if your coworker in the next cubicle like layers up the cologne and it's just way too much, it's overwhelming, right? You might not like that, right? It's not a great smell. You might even get a headache from it, but it's not like you're going to die because of that, right? Whereas if you get the wrong virus or whatever, it could be harmful. The wrong smell, it just sucks. You just don't like it. In multifamily buildings, we have the problem like where one person's complaining they always smell whatever their neighbor's cooking. Well, yeah, the building's probably not sealed very well. Your air is leaking into their apartment and vice versa. We'd like to be able to get rid of that if we can, and we'll deal with that kind of stuff. It could be cooking odors from a restaurant. It could be if you got a pet shop, pet shops always stink. It could be the locker room, at the high school, right? All those kind of places, I want to get rid of those odors. I don't know if you guys have seen this. I'm sure you have. And it's now like 10 months old, so I probably could drop it out of my slide deck here. But I'm going to keep it in for a little while. When the COVID stuff first started happening last year, Obviously, most of us shut down in mid-March and kind of went on lockdown. And then by April, like all my friends and family were texting me literally these screenshots from all these news magazines and stuff, you know, and asking me because they know I'm in the air conditioning industry and they know that I am involved in IAQ stuff. And they're going, dude, does air conditioning, you know, cause COVID? Like, should I not run my air conditioner this summer? Like, tons and tons of people were texting me this stuff. And I'm going like, what? How could it cause COVID? Like, it's a virus. Like, that doesn't make any sense. So I started reading these articles that they're talking about, and every single one of these articles they sent me is all pointing back to the exact same restaurant in China, which is one of the early places that had an outbreak. So the folks at Ashrae, and if you're not familiar with Ashrae, it's American Society of Heating and Refrigeration and Air Conditioning Engineers. And that is exactly why we call it Ashrae, because that name is a mouthful. They analyzed this particular restaurant in China to figure out what the heck was going on. And this is kind of the deal. So this is the restaurant. Remember my mouse, right? The people in red are people that came that day and got infected with COVID. So one person had COVID-19, sat in this area of the restaurant, and infected the other people in red. The people in yellow over there didn't get it. And none of the people over here in yellow got it at all. Only the people up there. And because they had these wall-mounted air conditioners, right, ductless mini-split basically, and that air was being circulated in a loop like this, the obvious conclusion was, well, you know, the air conditioning system's pushing the air around, spreading it around to all those people, and that's why they got sick. No, they got sick because some dude came there when he had a virus, right? And the reason that they got sick wasn't necessarily because this guy was circulating air. It's because he was recirculating the same crappy air over and over and over and over again, and they had no fresh air bringing in to dilute it. Well, technically, if you look at the slide, it says they had 0.75 liters per second. I don't know what the heck that is because I don't deal with liters. So when I converted that, that's 2.1 CFM, cubic feet per minute. That is basically zero. As you're going to see in a little bit, most of the codes are going to be looking for 15, 20 plus CFM per person of outside air at a legal minimum. This is like 1/10 of the legal minimum of fresh air. So the primary reason why that people spread COVID from one to another in that seating area is because they were just recirculating the same air over and over again and not bringing any new fresh air in at all to dilute it down. So yeah, I guess you could say the AC spread COVID, but the fact that the AC was done improperly is the reason why it helps spread COVID, right? Just AC itself is not the problem. And by the way, it could have easily been heating, you know, or any ventilation or any fan-based system would have done the same thing if you weren't bringing in fresh air. So we're going to talk about fresh air specifically. If you didn't know, the outdoor air is almost always significantly better than the indoor air. Indoor air is like the worst air you can breathe, right? And every time I say that in a class, it makes me want to get up off my desk and go stand outside and teach class out there. But it's the worst air. And now, if you live next to a coal-fired power plant or something and there's all kinds of crap being spewed into the air, okay, maybe then your outdoor air is worse than your indoor, maybe. But in general, for 99% of the U.S. population, the indoor air is significantly worse than the outdoor air. So I want to bring outdoor air in to dilute down the indoor air. Bring me that fresh air from outside. And if I bring more air into my building, other air has to leave. Right? It's not like I suck air into the building and then it just keeps blowing up like a balloon and expanding and then my walls bust open. Right? It doesn't work like that. If I bring 1,000 CFM of fresh air in, somewhere else 1,000 CFM of bad air has to leave. And that's what I want to do. I want to intentionally bring fresh air in, and I want to have targeted places where I bring air out. So I always have an air exchange of fresh air. Now, I don't need 100% outside air. I can have some recirculation, and in fact, I will, because if I bring 100% outside air in, which means 100% exhaust, the air comes through my building one time. If I did that, it would be extremely expensive to heat and cool my building. So I'm going to be bringing in, depending on your building, and we'll talk about some different ways to figure that out, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30% outside air, right? Normal buildings are going to be between 10 and 30% of their air comes from the outdoors, which means that 70 to 90% of the air is recirculated. And that if I do that throughout the course of the hour, I'm going to get enough air changes that it's going to be, you know, code acceptable and desirable. Places that I have to think about for air. Now, first off, I'm talking about ventilation air. There's also other air that has to be sucked into the building for very specific appliances, right? So here we're saying like furnaces. A lot of commercial buildings don't have furnaces. Some do. Most of them have like rooftop-based equipment, in which case the combustion air is all outside, doesn't involve the building, if you will. But if you have a boiler, that's inside the building. If you do have small furnaces for like a storefront or something like that, you might have combustion air that needs to come in the building if you have furnaces. And then, of course, if it's residential, you'll have some of these other things like fireplaces and stuff. But you may even have water heaters that need combustion air. So the things in your house or building that are going to be burning a fuel have to have combustion air. We want to get that combustion air from outside. We'd like to take it directly from outdoors and bring it directly to the appliance. But if we don't do that, then the appliance will just have some louvers on the front of its door, and it'll be sucking air in from your space. And if it does that, then I have to bring more air into my space to take care of that. But either way, anything burning a fuel is going to have an exhaust pipe. And if I have an exhaust pipe sucking air out, I have to have something else bringing combustion air in. Right? And we're not talking about that right now. I have to just do that. That's not for ventilation. That I have to do that, and then I have to do a certain amount of more outside air for ventilation purposes. We also have a bunch of places we need to take air out of the building. So anytime there is air in a building that is undesirable, I want to directly exhaust that to the outdoors. So for example, in the office building you're sitting in right now, or even your house if you're working from home today, which many of you are. I mean, it's Friday, so half of you are working from home even on a normal year, right? But this year, probably everybody is. But even in a commercial building, the bathrooms need to have an exhaust fan. You're doing stuff in the bathroom that doesn't smell good. There's no reason to let that float out the door and go down by everybody's desks. Let's just suck it right out, right? Locker rooms have showers and stuff like that. There's no reason to let that moisture linger in there and then hence become mildewy and moldy on places. Moldew. There's no such thing as mildew and mold. But let's go ahead and suck that air directly out along with its moisture and get rid of it, right? If I have places where I'm storing and using chemicals like a janitor closet, directly exhaust it. If it's a commercial building that has a kitchen, there should definitely be exhaust sources there. Even if it's a small building and I just have like a little kitchenette, right? There's no oven and stove, right? But I might even want to have an exhaust fan in there because people are cooking stuff in the microwave, and might have odors and stuff in there because they cook their weird smelling food in there of whatever odd things that they like and you don't. Let's put a small exhaust fan in there just to keep air moving out of the break room, if you will. So those places I'm going to want to exhaust on purpose to get rid of air. So I have some things that need combustion air coming in. I have some things that have exhaust air going out. Then in addition to all of that, I also need to bring that fresh air ventilation in, like I was talking about before. How much do I need to bring in? Well, there's two different documents that I can go to find that information. And the good thing is that those documents have the same table. So if you weren't aware, Ashrae, the group I mentioned before, the air conditioning engineers, they have a standard called Ashrae 62.1. 62.1 is for commercial, 62.2 is for residential buildings. This is the indoor air quality and ventilation standard that the entire country uses. Many of the codes adopt Ashrae standard 62 directly, or they cut and paste like 90% of it and put it in their code. So the IMC, which is the International Mechanical Code, has the exact same tables as Ashrae 62.1. Ashrae 62.1 gets updated every 3 years. IMC gets updated every 3 years. They do it 18 months after Ashrae. So Ashrae comes out, which is the engineers. They have all their research and all their documentation on what we need to do for all kinds of stuff, whether it's ventilation, energy, refrigerants, whatever it is. They make their documents. And then 18 months later, all the code entities, which is the International Code Council, takes all that research and language, makes it into code enforceable language, like strong, thou shall do it type language. And then they send that document out. And then most of the municipalities will adopt the international codes, right? So in Massachusetts, where like 70-some% of you guys are from when you registered today, you're following the International Mechanical Code 2015 version. And I imagine at some point they'll update to the 2018 version, and then when they'll eventually update to 2001. So typically Ashrae comes out 18 months later, the international codes adopt all the Ashrae language, and then usually 3, 4, 5 years later, the municipalities adopt that same language. They're on a little bit of a slower scale. Energy codes, if you didn't know, work the same way. We have Ashrae standard 90.1, which is the energy standard for the entire country, and in fact for the entire world. By the way, these Ashrae things, it's American society, but that ceased to be the American society decades ago. It's definitely the global society. Ashrae is like 60-some thousand members across the whole globe that's doing all this stuff. But the energy code works the same way. Ashrae 90.1 comes out. 18 months later, the International Code Council adopts almost everything in that Ashrae book, like 90-some% of it. And then a year or two later, the local states and municipalities adopt the International Energy Conservation Code. And here in Massachusetts, we are on IECC 2018 now, I believe we switched to. So in any case, Ashrae or IMC is going to have these tables. There's 3 or 4 pages of tables that look like the one I'm showing you here. And the way it works is you need to find your category of building, so correctional facilities, educational facilities, restaurants, etc. Let's look at office buildings as our example here today. So I got office buildings on here. It's just one of many of the pages on here. And the way that this table works is that, first off, unless you're if you're the United States, just ignore this column. We don't care about liters per second, and we don't care about liters per second. So that makes it a lot simpler. We get rid of those 2 things. Now I have 2 things to deal with. I have CFM per person, and I have CFM per square foot. It used to be just one combined number of CFM per person, and it was, depending on the vintage of the codes and standards, it was 15 to 20 CFM per person typically. And we used to do it that way. But then in 2004 for Ashrae, 2009 for the International Code, we separated it into 2 things: CFM per person at a smaller number than we used to have, plus CFM per square foot. The reason we did that is because we want to make you do math. No, I'm just kidding. The reason we did that is for the purpose of demand control ventilation, which I'll explain in about 15-20 minutes. But we had to split it up. So what it means is a given space is not always the same density of occupants. I may have 8 by 8 cubicles with 100 people in there, or I may have 20 foot by 20 foot private offices with 13 people in there for the same square footage. So it's not always the same. We need to have a ventilation rate per person because people bring pollutants in. They have dirt on them, they have viruses on them, they cough, they wear weird perfumes, they smell bad, whatever it is. I want to dilute their body odors and things down, their bioaffluents down. Then the building itself has its own pollutants. The VOCs coming off the furniture that we bought, right? The trash can that nobody emptied, the kitchen that someone forgot to turn the exhaust fan on after they cooked their weird thing in the microwave, right? So we got to ventilate for the building, right? And that amount of ventilation is the same if I have 1 person there or 50 people there, because the building is the building. So I got to ventilate for the people and for the building. So if I take a typical office space on the current codes, this is for all the Ashrae. And this table applies to Ashrae and IMC, and it has not really changed since 2006. So pretty much every state is on this version now. Or they're on different versions, but this table, this part of it's the same. So I need the office space, which is 5 CFM per person, plus the building, which is 0.06 CFM per square foot. So if I make some easy assumptions here, let's say I have 100 people, right, at 5 CFM per person. For you math wizards out there, that's 500 CFM. CFM is cubic feet per minute, the volume of air. And then I'll also make my life easy and say I have 10,000 square feet for those 100 people. Well, 10,000 square feet times 0.06, that comes out to 600. So that means I need a grand total of 1,100 CFM of fresh outside air coming into this space. Now, the main air handling system may do, let's say, 10,000 CFM. And I need to get 1,100 from outside. So that's 11% outside air in that example, which means 89% of it can be recirculated, right? If I only had a 5,000 CFM system, okay, great. Then that means I have 22% of it coming from the outdoors, right? Which means I have 78% of it being recirculated, and so on. If I take the amount of air I need per person and multiply that out, and the amount of air I need per square foot and multiply that out, and then I add the 2 together. Every space isn't the same. This example was an office space. If I did a classroom for first graders, right, or elementary in general, I need 10 CFM per person, not 5, double, because kids are dirtier, I guess. I don't know. They have more germs, I suppose. And then I need actually literally double for the building as well. So it ends up being that a classroom for kids has double the ventilation rate as I would for an office space for adults. And other spaces will be different. Like a daycare is even more. It's 10 for each kid, and it's 0.18 for the building. There's all kinds of stuff in a daycare. There's toys that kids are licking and putting back on the shelf. Well, there was pre-COVID. Now the toys sit in sealed boxes and the kids can't touch them, which is another problem. I'll leave my COVID commentary out for going forward. I'm just ready to get back to somewhat normalness here. Brian typed in a question asking if this is just outside air. Yes, this CFM that we're talking about, so in my example, the 1,100 CFM, that is just the outdoor air requirement, nothing else. The total CFM that your air handling system needs to move, air handling system would mean your rooftop, your air handler, your fan coil, your furnace, the total CFM, cubic feet per minute of air you have to move, is dictated by the heating and cooling loads. So we would do a load calculation on the building to figure out, and the individual spaces served in the building, how much heating and cooling capacity you need, how many BTUs per hour you need to heat this space and cool this space, and then we would select the amount of airflow we need to support those BTUs. Then unrelated to that, we'd figure out how much outside air we need, which is this table here. Right? So I might have, like I said, I might have an example where I need 10,000 CFM of outside air, but now I have to get 1,100 from the outdoors, right? So that's 11%. If you guys can follow my chicken scratch with the mouse, you're saints. But then I may also have a different space that is only 5,000 CFM of cooling needed, but I still needed the 1,100 CFM of outside air, right? So that one's 22% outside air. So if anyone ever tells you, hey, your building should have this percent of outside air, they're absolutely totally full of crap. The percent is just something I'm giving you as an example. At no point in time should your engineer or your field technician go up to the ventilation damper and set it for a certain percent. That's just a coincidence. The percent is what? Well, it depends on how much I had and how much of it has to come from outdoors. And that's not the same on every job. It's always different. So that has to be calculated. Let's see. Greg is typing something in. Does the 1,100 CFM in this example need to be continuous or only when the HVAC is running? That's an excellent question. So the answer is both. It has to be continuous and when the HVAC is running. Well, what do I mean by that? I mean during the occupied hours of the building, you will be required, in our example, to bring in 1,100 CFM of outside air continuously, which means your HVAC has to be running continuously. All commercial buildings in all municipalities in all states always have to have the fan running during occupied hours by code. So some of you have thermostats where it says fan on and fan auto. That's a residential thermostat. If that's in your commercial building, which is very common, by the way, you're not legally allowed to put it in the auto mode. That is not allowable. That stat shouldn't even be in the building. But that's what ends up happening because residential stats are cheaper, so people put them in. And I don't know why you'd spend $300,000 on an HVAC system and then worry about saving $30 on the thermostat, but that's what happens. So your thermostat absolutely positively has to be in the on function during all building occupied hours. And then at nighttime, it could be an auto. Auto means it only turns the fan on if there's a need for heating and cooling. On means the fan on is all the time. So during the day, let's just say you have a normal office building. It's open from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. So at 7 a.m., the ventilation damper, the fan needs to turn on, and the ventilation damper needs to go, in our example, to 1,100 CFM opening to bring fresh air in. And then at 6 p.m., that damper should go shut and stay shut all night long because no one's there. You don't have to ventilate a building that's not occupied. If nobody's there, who are you ventilating for, right? So you only have to ventilate during the occupied hours. Now, many of us will program it so we start the ventilation like an hour before occupied just to kind of purge that, the VOCs that have kind of accumulated in there. But in general, it's during the occupied hours. And at nighttime, you don't have to do that. So you shut the ventilation damper, preferably leave it shut, although most buildings make the mistake of not doing that. Leave it shut, and then turn the fan on only if the heat or cooling needs to come on. Hopefully that answers the question, Greg. And I think I answered Mike's question inadvertently. What if the building is unoccupied, the OA damper closed? The OA damper should close when the building's unoccupied. I will tell you that more than 80% of buildings don't do that because they don't even know that. Now, if you have a building automation system, a computer-based network system, you're probably doing that. If you have regular thermostats on the wall, you 100% for certain are not doing that because it requires an extra wire to go from it requires a special thermostat that costs $10 more than the other stats. And then it requires a special wire, an extra wire to go from the thermostat over to the outdoor economizer damper to tell it to shut at nighttime. Otherwise, the rooftop unit and the ventilation damper don't even know it's nighttime. If you're not sure, if you don't know how a regular thermostat works, it has a request for fan, a request for heat, and a request for cool. That's the only three things it does. And maybe you have two-stage equipment, so second stage heat, second stage cool. It doesn't do anything else. It knows nothing else. It just does those things. It literally closes a switch that tells the rooftop, turn on the heat, turn on the cool, turn on the fan. You have to have an extra switch inside your thermostat and an extra wire to tell it to open or shut the ventilation damper. If you don't do that, then the ventilation damper just always opens up every time the fan's on. That's pretty common. Mike asks, who are you ventilating for when unoccupied? Boilers, VOC. So we're not ventilating when it's unoccupied. However, if I have, say, for example, boilers, I would still bring combustion air in for the boilers, but the combustion air is a separate airflow path to the boiler room. And we're talking about the airflow path to the building occupied areas where humans are at. So I have to have, like we were saying before, I have to have the combustion air for my combustion appliances. What happened to my mouse? What did I click on here? Oh, okay. Sorry about that. I have to have the combustion air for my combustion appliances, and that's a separate inlet to the boiler room, unrelated to what we're talking about. And we have an inlet air to the human spaces. The VOCs will not be taken care of at night, right? Because like you said, there's no one there, so who cares if there's VOCs in the space? But I usually program it, and many people program it, to say if my building's going to go occupied at 7 a.m., I'll start my ventilation cycle at 6 a.m., so I have an hour of runtime to purge all the VOCs out of the space, because they're going to kind of accumulate in there over the day. Just like when you, if you have a brand new car, right? It's only 5 months old or whatever. When you first get in your car in the morning, you can smell that new car smell. But then you drive around with your windows open for a while, you don't smell it anymore, right? Because the VOCs from your car products, your seating material and all that accumulate in the car, and they're locked in there. The same with your building. The VOCs will accumulate during the day, during the nighttime when there's no ventilation, and when you first come in, there'll be a lot of VOCs in there. So we'll turn on what we call a pre-occupancy purge to ventilate the space early on. Will asks, lots of commercial buildings and schools have no OA ventilation unless the windows are open. Please comment. Yeah, so older buildings, and sometimes new buildings, but usually older buildings will have what's called natural ventilation, right? Now, I work for a HVAC distributor in my spare time, right, a mechanical company, so I'm totally opposed to natural ventilation. I'm like, just because it has the word natural doesn't mean it's good, right? It's not like it's natural foods, right? Natural ventilation means that I'm going to let the building accidentally bring air in, versus mechanical ventilation where I'm going to force it in and I'm going to measure it. So natural ventilation means I don't have an outside air intake on my air handler. I don't bring fresh air in through my mechanical system. I have operable windows. That means the windows that can open and shut. But then I have to rely on the occupants to open the windows at the correct times. Well, if I want to do this for code compliance, guess when the windows need to be open? Whenever the building's occupied. Well, if it's cold out, they're not opening the windows. If it's hot out, they're not opening the windows. They only open the windows in the spring and the fall, and even then, hardly at all. So natural ventilation is not really used correctly in my thought process. But I know that there's some trends to do it in some like LEED buildings and stuff like that. And a lot of those buildings will have natural ventilation options, plus they'll have mechanical ventilation. But yeah, older buildings typically won't. A lot of schools, if they have unit ventilators, which is by far the most common school design from like 1970, 1980s, 1990s, those units, those are the ones that sit on the wall below the window. It's like a shelf with a vent on top. On the back side of that, there's louvers that suck outside air in. So when you walk outside the school, and under each classroom window, you see that little louvered panel. That's the fresh air sucking in. That is by far the most dominant school design from like the 1970s and later. But before that, which is a lot of schools, you'll find plenty of schools that were built in 1940s, 50s, and 60s. They probably just had like radiators, right, or baseboard heaters, and they didn't have any ventilation, and they relied on the windows. Those places are not good for ventilation, not good for child learning. I can give you dozens of studies that would show why those aren't going to be good spaces for kids to have long-term learning. And the fresh air is definitely a benefit to your ability to learn. So yeah, we'd like to get fresh air in those spaces. A lot of times it's just kind of been like, oh, it's kind of grandfathered in. It's like an old building, like it is what it is. But this year, or last year rather, with COVID, it really brought those spaces to light. And lots of schools are scrambling to find ways to get fresh air into the classrooms now, or do more filtration and purification to make up for the lack of fresh air that they have. And we'll talk about some of those methods in a little bit here. All right, a couple more questions, and then I'm going to move on so we stay on path here. Elijah says the minimum OA rate should be RA plus RP. Yes, correct. Let me clear off all my slop here real quick. Right? So what he's talking about is RA right here and RP right here. You add the two of them together, and that becomes your minimum ventilation, meaning that is the legal code minimum. You cannot bring in any less air by law and be okay. You could bring in more. You're allowed to do more, but you can't do less. Right? Now, the problem with bringing in more is it becomes more costly. You got to pay to heat it. You got to pay to cool it, right? Pay to filter it, pay to humidify it, pay to dehumidify it. But bringing more fresh air in is better for the occupants. So there's that trade-off there. And some programs, like if you guys are familiar with LEED, some of the credits that you can earn, some of the points you can earn, if you will, are for, I don't want to call it over-ventilating, but bringing in more than the code-required ventilation air. All right, last question, and then I'm going to move on, and then I'll come back to your other questions later. Does a VFD on a supply fan affect the minimum outdoor air requirement? No, it doesn't affect the outdoor air requirements, but to your point, it does affect the actual outdoor air. So what he's talking about is a fan that has speed control. It speeds up and slows down. And there's numerous reasons and ways we would control that. And if you're interested in learning more about that, join us the next 2 weeks for the energy conservation days. We'll talk about VFDs as part of that discussion. So it's ramping the fan up and down. Well, obviously, if I take my airflow on my fan and I cut it in half, but my outside air intake opening is the same opening it was, I'm going to cut my outside air in half as well. The code doesn't allow me to do that. The code says you got to ramp the outside air up. So as I throttle the fan down to a lower speed, I have to increase the damper open. So I always get, in my example, the 1,100 CFM of outside air. And then the last question, I said I wouldn't do any more, but it does relate. The RP, the people rate here, he's asking if it's calculated at the maximum capacity. Yes. This would be the maximum capacity. So if my office building was designed for 30 people, even though I've only hired 28 to work there, I still have to design the ventilation for 30 people because eventually I'm going to hire those 2 people, or I'm going to sell the building and someone else is going to fill it with 30 people. So whatever the maximum ventilation rate is what you need to ventilate for. Now, we can do what's called demand controlled ventilation, and we can modulate that on the fly. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But for a normal everyday job, yes, we need to design it for the maximum amount of people. There are some places that can get some exceptions to that, right? So like maybe at a high school, for example, the gymnasium may allow 1,000 people in there, but that only happens on graduation day, right? Other than that, they're like, the most we're ever going to have in here is, you know, our basketball team sucks, right? So the most we're ever going to have in here is 500. And they may talk to their building authorities and design it for 500 instead of 1,000, saying, you know what, we're only going to have 1,000 in here once a year. It's only going to happen for like an hour and a half. And then we're all going to get the hell out of here. So we're not going to design it for that. And they might be like, all right, for that one little freaky day, let's roll on, right? But in general, yeah, whatever the occupancy is, you know, per the fire department, that's what you're going to roll with as far as the ventilation rate calculation. Most of these systems that we're dealing with have economizers, and we'll discuss economizers next Friday in detail. But if you didn't know what an economizer is, it's an outside air damper in your piece of equipment that allows you to suck in more outside air to get some free cooling, right? If I want to cool my building and it's 60 degrees outside, well, instead of turning a compressor on, let's just open up the damper and suck more outside air in. 60 degrees is going to help cool my building pretty good. So as far as ventilation rates go in a building, if you look at this chart here, this particular example is a 40% ventilation rate system, right? So I'm at 0.4 here. That's my ventilation rate I have to bring in for this particular project whenever it's occupied. So I'm bringing that all in during all the heating hours. I'm bringing that in during all the cooling hours in the summertime. But then in the spring and fall, or if I had any type of mild day in the summer, right, I'm going to open up this economizer damper and bring in more free air for cooling purposes. And that's great when I do that. And I can do that by itself or in conjunction with the compressors. And I'm going to bring in more ventilation. I'm going to overventilate to get the free cooling. But that's okay because the ventilation air is not bad. It's good for me. I just don't want to ventilate at 100% rate all the time because it's so expensive to do it during heating, and it's so expensive to do it during cooling. But in the middle time, I'm not really paying to heat and cool it. So let's take the free cold air and the bonus ventilation. The one thing you need to be cautious on, though, and if you look at, like, say, the Ashrae recommendations, which is obviously a trusted organization, they have entire documents they came out with in May on what to do with your HVAC system specifically related to COVID. And one of the recommendations was to bring in more fresh air. So recommendation 1 was get your building up to at least the code required amount of fresh air. Come on, you slackers, bring the fresh air in. And then the next recommendation was, well, why don't you try bringing in a little bit more? Instead of bringing in 20%, why don't you bring in 30% outside air, something like that. And that's okay if your system can handle it. And some systems can and some systems can't. But the more outside air you bring in, the more challenging it can become to ventilate or to take care of humidity control. So both Ashrae and CDC at various times the past 12 months have recommended bringing in more fresh air. And that's okay. Just make sure your HVAC engineer says, yeah, your system can handle it. Many cannot. So they should be able to handle the code required ventilation air, but bringing in extra air is going to be a challenge. And in this example here, this particular building was bringing in the code required amount of ventilation air, and then they jacked it up. I don't remember what they did, doubled or tripled it or something like that because of COVID. And you could see what happened to their indoor humidity. Things were nice and in check, 30, 40%. All right, and then we get to June all of a sudden the next day when they turned it on, and we're up in the 60s. So just be careful with that. Mike asks, what percent of economizers are screwed up? Biggest issue. Yeah, we'll talk about that in detail next week on Friday. But there's 2 different studies that I'm aware of that relate to economizers and their and the fact that they're set up right or wrong. Economizers are one of the ways to bring fresh air in. And depending on which study you're looking at, one of them is like 63% of economizers are either failed or set up wrong. And then a more recent study from Honeywell shows and Honeywell makes these things, shows 70% of them are failed or set up incorrectly. So yeah, that's a huge issue. These things get set up wrong all the time. So we'll have to deal with that, and we certainly can. All right, I'm going to briefly talk about demand control ventilation to kind of explain how that works. I'll probably skip a few of the slides in the interest of time here because you guys asked such good questions, which is cool. But demand control ventilation is a way to make sure I'm getting the code required ventilation air, but I'm not over ventilating. Now, over ventilating has benefits, but there's also cons, which is energy consumption and humidity control. So normally in a non-COVID year, I'd want to bring in the ventilation air from this table, right? But if only half the people show up to work, maybe I can bring in half of the amount of people portion of the ventilation, right? I'm bringing in 5 CFM per person for 100 people. Well, if only 50 are there, shouldn't I be able to take 50 times 5 and not bring that in? Yeah, I absolutely can. And the entire and only reason that in the codes we split this into 2 numbers and made you do the math was so we can do demand control ventilation. That is literally the reason why. So what demand control ventilation does is it takes into effect the concept that we control the temperature in a space historically, but we don't control the ventilation. It's just like on off, like it's you're there, you're not there kind of thing. So what we want to do is actually measure the ventilation in the space and control to that ventilation rate. I probably should have took this one out, but since I put it on, I'll explain it real quick. A lot of the old buildings that you guys work on were designed, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and those buildings had pretty high ventilation rates. And some of that was taken care of by operable windows, some of them with mechanical systems. But for the purpose of this discussion, ignore the giant pyramid. Most of the stuff that you're working on has either been built or redesigned since World War II, when we had more normal ventilation rates. 10 CFM per person was pretty common. We went down to 5 CFM per person in the 70s as a reaction to the energy embargo. And that was a cluster F because it caused sick buildings. So we had to undo that. So at Ashrae, we overcompensated the other way and tripled it up to 15 CFM per person, then eventually 20 CFM per person. And right now we're at approximately 17. I say approximately. This is an office building chart. I say approximately 17 because now it's division. You got to add these 2 things together. But if you take the typical occupancy, this density over here, right here, and multiply it out, it comes out to about 17 CFM per person for an average density. But you don't do it by that anymore. In any case, most of the buildings that are out there now, when you rehab them and bring them up to the current codes, the ventilation rate is going to need to be higher. So the way demand control ventilation works is you take your space. In this case, it was a retail space, a bank, and that one is 7.5 CFM per person plus 0.06. Whereas if you recall, the office was 5 plus 0.06, the school was 10 plus 0.12. Well, for retail, it's 7.5 plus 0.06. So for this little bank designed for 25 people, with the fire department placard, it would require 488 CFM per person. But then if 25 people weren't there and there was only 5 people there, which is most of the day, I would have still brought in 488. And later on, when this lady's by herself counting up all the cash, it's still 488 because the system doesn't know there's nobody there. It just doesn't know. So what I want to do is give it a way to know. I want to have it count the people and then change the ventilation for the amount of people. Let's get the right amount of air to the right place at the right time. And how are we going to do that? So the way we're going to do that is by measuring CO2 in the space, carbon dioxide. If you're not aware, carbon dioxide is what you exhale out of your mouth, right? You suck oxygen in, you exhale carbon dioxide. Plants do the opposite. It is not CO, carbon monoxide. That's a totally different beast. Nothing to do with each other other than they both have carbon and oxygen in them. But other than that, they have nothing to do with each other. Carbon monoxide is an odorless, deadly gas that's the product of incomplete combustion. Not related to this discussion at all. This is CO2. The 2 is very important. Carbon dioxide. You exhale it out of your mouth all the time. And because people breathe at fairly predictable rates, if I know how much CO2 is in the space, I can basically estimate how many people are there, and hence I can modulate your ventilation rate. Every single code allows you to do this now. It wasn't always the case. I started doing this in, I think 2000 was the first time I did a CO2 job, maybe 1999, which was a great year, by the way. But at that point, it wasn't really code allowed. I mean, it wasn't code prohibited, but it wasn't allowed. It was just not thought of. But then in 2004 to 2006 range, all the codes started saying that it was okay to do this. So you're going to exhale at a predictable rate, and we're going to measure that rate. Depending on what you're doing, your activity level will influence how much you breathe, which will influence how much CO2 you produce, right? So for our example, it's going to be typically like offices and schools, and in those cases, it's pretty normal amount of rate, right? So here's the ventilation rate for someone in an office. Sleeping is pretty much the same as office work, not much difference there. But if you start going to the gym and stuff and working out, all of a sudden you're making 2, 3, 4 times the amount of CO2 because you're really active. But let's say we have offices, for example, and we have a predictable CO2 ventilation rate. If we double the amount of people, we double the amount of CO2 production. As I bring fresh air in from outside, I will dilute that CO2 back down because the outside air coming in has very little CO2 relative to the amount you're breathing out of your mouth. So I will be able to control the ventilation by measuring the CO2 in the space. It does take a little bit of time, depending on the ventilation rate that I have. It takes a little bit of time for those numbers to pan out. So if I was at approximately that 17 CFM per person range, I'm somewhere between the blue or the green and yellow line, it would take me like a half an hour or so to kind of stabilize the room. That doesn't mean I wait a half an hour to start opening the ventilation damper. I will start opening it right away. As soon as people come into the conference room, I'll start ventilating. As they leave, I'll slow down the ventilation rate. So if I do this in this space, if I go back to I lost my little mouse again. My computer's thinking. Deep thoughts. Okay. So I got the occupied space, fully designed, 25 people, 488 CFM for my little bank. If only 5 people are there, I'll throttle it back to 338. I'm going to modulate the per person number, but not the square footage number. The 0.06 stays the same. The 7.5 per person gets modulated down. And then when she's by herself, I'm down to 308 because I got the square footage plus 1 person at 7.5. So I was able to modulate from 488 down to 308, right? So that's 180 difference. Doesn't sound like a big deal, but that's a half a ton of cooling, right? That's going to save me some decent amount of energy. And the bigger the building gets, the more and more savings I'm going to be having in this regard. I'm going to ventilate the building based on who's actually there, not based on what I thought might be there. I'm going to skip a few of these in time. This is allowed by all the mechanical codes now. So we'll skip that. Just trust me that that's a true statement. Every mechanical code allows demand control ventilation literally written into the code, right? And I won't read you guys code slides because that's boring. But if you need any of this stuff, let me know. The energy codes not only allow it, but actually require it now. It's not even an optional thing. All of the energy codes have a requirement for every area that has an energy code, which is like, I think 38 states have an energy code at this point. All of them require demand control ventilation. Not for every single space, just for the densely occupied spaces. What does that mean? Well, based on the code that we're using in Massachusetts, and for my coworkers sitting next to me here in Illinois, same code we use in Massachusetts and Illinois. Anytime I have a space that's 25 people per 1,000 square foot ratio density, what does that mean? That means conference rooms, classrooms, restaurants, those kind of places are going to have to do man control ventilation. There's some exceptions, right, for really small systems and for things that are not people-based, like a process load for a computer room or whatever, some weird things like that. But the normal spaces, I'm going to have to do that. So we're going to try to get the ventilate for the actual occupancy versus what we assume it's going to be, stop the over ventilation, which wastes energy, and lower our operating cost. What does this look like on an actual building? All right, well, this chart is from a real building. At this point, this building's from like 1998. I probably need a newer chart, but every building looks the same. It literally does. Every office building has a graph like this. So what this is showing me on the graph is midnight to midnight along the bottom axis. The vertical axis is the design ventilation rate. That's not how much air I'm moving into the building. Excuse me, that's not how much air I'm moving in the building. I'm probably moving something way, way, way up here, right, as far as total CFM. But this is how much I'm moving for ventilation. So it's, 20, 30, 40% of the total. But this is my peak ventilation, what my design would have been had I not had demand ventilation. So what ends up happening on these DCV jobs, let's say the building goes occupied at 7 a.m. Okay, great. A normal job, I would turn the ventilation on. I would run it all day long, and then I would shut it off. Now at night, I should be shutting it off completely, but the vast majority of buildings turn it on whenever the fan's on, per, I think, Michael's question earlier. So it actually would turn on, off, on, off, on, off, on, off. Instead of having a zigzagging up and down on this chart, we just averaged it out for how often it actually ran throughout the nighttime, and it was like 28% for this job or something like that. So it's shown that way. So what a DCV job does in purple is 7 o'clock comes, we don't go to full ventilation rate, right? We go to just the building square footage portion of the ventilation rate, and I'm allowed to modulate the rest of it based on when people show up. Well, guess what? Everybody doesn't show up to work at the same time, or even on time for that matter, right? And then at 11 o'clock, half people cut out for lunch, so they're not there. I don't have to ventilate for them if they're not there. If they went out to lunch, I'm not ventilating for them, right? Or nowadays with COVID, this whole giant purple pyramid would be half as big because half people are working remote, right? Most people come back from lunch, not everybody, and then people start cutting out early to go golfing, right? This is like every single office building in America has what we call the 2-hump profile. If you look at federal studies, office buildings, 2-hump profile, right? Restaurants, a 3-hump profile. Most of these buildings have predictable profiles, which is nice because we can then predict energy savings. What do some of these energy savings look like? So for an office building, if I do demand control ventilation, I'm probably going to be saving 25 to 30% of my ventilation CFM. So I don't have to heat it and cool it, which saves me a lot of energy, obviously. Retail space, I'm reducing it by like 90%, right? Because those spaces are designed for, what's the day? The day after Thanksgiving. Black Friday type day, way up here, but hardly ever is it a Black Friday day, so I'm usually at some lower rate, right? Restaurants, same thing. They're designed for some kind of Saturday night dinner crowd with maximum amount of people, but if I don't have the maximum amount of people, which I hardly ever do, I'm at some lower rate. At 10 a.m. on Tuesday, the place is an empty place, right? Schools, it's a big reduction as well, and that's coming from multiple reasons. One, your classroom might be designed for 35 kids. You only have 27 this year. Okay, well, right there's eight kids I don't have to ventilate for, right? The summertime, I'm either not running the class or I'm having reduced hours, reduced occupancy, so I'm saving some there. But then the really big piece of it comes from the fact that in a normal school, at least one that has ventilation, that 1980s and later built, in a normal school, I ventilate each room for the design occupancy. But those people aren't in the room all day. My kids don't, well, I don't know what the hell's going on now with school, but normal year, my kids don't spend all day in their classroom. They leave their classroom and they go to the gym for PE. And guess who's in their classroom? Nobody. So why am I ventilating their classroom? I should throttle that ventilation rate back. And then they come back to the classroom and I can ventilate again. And then they go to lunch. I can stop ventilating. Then they go to the art room. Then they go to recess. Whatever they're doing, I don't need to ventilate the rooms for all those things. Because each kid can only be in one room at a time. But each room was designed assuming it had the maximum amount of kids. So I get a lot of variability throughout the day on where I need to ventilate when it comes to a school. Paybacks are pretty quick on demand ventilation because the sensors are inexpensive and the damper system is already typically there. The control system on the dampers, for most cases, can already handle this. So I'm literally just adding a sensor and turning a few features on in the damper. So it's pretty easy and pretty quick payback for a lot of these spaces. The more heavily occupied the space and the more variable the occupancy, the faster the payback. A movie theater, for example, holds 500 people, but on a Tuesday at 11 a.m., there's like 13 people in there, right? So it's designed for a lot of people, but it has a high variability to it, right? Whereas like, I don't know, a 911 call center, it's designed for 10 people to sit at those desks. Guess what? All 10 people kind of have to show up for work. There's no like, we're only going to go half staff today kind of thing. That's not a thing, right? For that kind of space. All right, I'm going to skip a few of these in the interest of time. I want to show you this chart, though. This is when CO2 is a good candidate. So I've been using this chart literally since I started working here in the late 90s. And this chart, A means it's a great application for demand ventilation. You should definitely do it. It's going to have a good payback. It's going to make a lot of sense. C means it's a horrible idea. Don't do it. You'll probably get sued. B meant come back to me with your information. Let's talk about this project. It's a maybe. Right? So real quick, some examples. A, classrooms, music rooms, libraries, auditoriums, movie theaters, any type of indoor sporting venue, right? You got a college basketball gym that's designed for 5,000 spectators, but your team sucks, so you only have 1,000 there most of the time. Why are you ventilating for 5,000? That kind of thing. Office buildings, retail spaces. We typically don't mess with hospitals. However, we'll do the lobbies and the cafeteria and that kind of stuff. We won't mess with any of the patient areas. Hotels are great candidates. All the meeting rooms and conference rooms that are sporadically used are fantastic. Gymnasiums. If you still go to the disco, if that's still a thing, that tells you how old this chart is. That's a good candidate. Bowling alleys, all that kind of stuff. The ones that are bad are typically ones that either don't have a variableness to people or they have non-people pollutants that are pretty harmful. So, for example, at a prison, the guard station, bad candidate. Everybody kind of has to be at their guard station. We can't like just not show up for work at that kind of job. So there's no reason, there's no variability. It doesn't make sense. Dry cleaners. The reason we ventilate a lot in a dry cleaner is not because the two dudes working in the back. It's because of all the chemicals they're dealing with, right? Locker rooms, they already smell horrible. Pet shops already smell horrible. Don't cut the ventilation rate back in a place that already smells like crap. You can do demand ventilation in kitchens and parking garages. It just won't be CO2 based. Right, we have different systems for that. So on the CO2 chart, which this chart is, we don't do those kind of spaces. Places that have manufacturing that have chemicals, paint booths, anything regulated by FDA, that's a hard no. Anything regulated by the Department of Health, probably a no. Swimming pools, they add chlorine. The maybes, right? So what's a maybe on here? Let's pick one. A beauty salon, right? Let's say it's like a nail salon, right? Well, the nail salons, sometimes they have like the little mini exhaust fans right where the nail technician works that exhaust all those steams directly out. In that case, I could do demand ventilation for the rest of the space. But if they don't have that, then I can't mess with it. I need a lot of outside air coming in and a lot of exhaust air going out. A furniture store, they always get new furniture. New furniture has the most VOCs. Probably not going to do it there, right? So you can see what happens with some of these kind of spaces. Residential, hotels, apartments, those are all probably not going to happen. There's not enough people density in each individual apartment for this to be interesting at all. Casinos were a maybe because you used to be allowed to smoke in them. Now you can't, so they probably would switch over to a yes, that kind of thing. Brian asks, if we measure CO2 in our HVAC, how often should we calibrate? I'll address that. Michael asks about reliability of CO2 sensors. I will address that. Do you need the base ventilation rate 24/7? I did not address that, but that's this slide right here. You don't need to do the base ventilation rate 24/7. What's the base ventilation rate? The base ventilation rate is the current codes. If I look at the square footage portion of ventilation, that's my base ventilation rate. And then that'll modulate up to the design ventilation rate up here at the top, which is the base, the square footage, plus the people portion, right? So I don't modulate it from, remember my old example of 1100? I don't go from 1100 down to 0. I go from 1100 down to 600 because I had 600 was my building CFM requirement. 500 was my peak people requirement. I modulate to 500. So I modulate between 600 and 1100 in that example. But I don't have to do it 24/7. Once the building goes unoccupied, I shut the whole ventilation system off. If one person comes in to clean the desks or whatever at night, that's fine. there's so much volume of air in a space like that, relative to the one cleaning person, there's still plenty of fresh air in the space. No problem there, and that's allowed by code to do that. Reza's question is so big I have to expand the screen here to see it. I see DCV savings happens during the hour that you are mechanically cooling and heating and not when you are in a economizer, correct? I guess that would be correct, yeah. You wouldn't be getting the DCV savings during economizer hours, but you get all the economizer savings, which is significantly larger than the DCV savings. I'm going to intentionally open up my outside damper to get free cooling, which means I don't have to run my compressor, which is the most expensive single item I have to run. So yes, you would, during economizer hours, you get a huge amount of savings, but it does not come from the demand ventilation. It comes from the free cooling. All right, we keep moving on this chart here because we've got a whole bunch of stuff to go through here still. All right, as far as the set points go, I'll give you the simple version here in the interest of time. This is showing CFM rates. This is of outside air coming in. Sorry, this is showing parts per million of CO2 and CFM on the right-hand side. Where I normally want to be is somewhere in this ideal range. I don't want to be underventilated. That's not healthy. I don't want to be overventilated because that's energy wasteful. So for most spaces, let's say for like an office building, what I want to be is 700 CFM of, parts per million, parts per million of CO2 above the outdoor air level. In most areas of the country, I'll see like 450 parts per million. Now, if I'm in a densely urban area like Boston, Chicago, New York, whatever, maybe I'm going to have more like 500, maybe 520, something like that. But for most places, you know, suburbia, if you will, I'll have 450 parts per million of CO2 outside. I want to be 700 above that for my set point. So my set point becomes 1150 parts per million. If I was in some rural place, it'd be maybe it's like 400. So now my set point's 1100. If I was in densely occupied, you know, urban downtown area, maybe it's 500. But it's going to be something similar to that. So 1100 to 1200 is going to be my set point for most of these buildings. That's going to be a pretty common spot. Reliability. Someone asked about that. It used to be a big deal. And as did calibration used to be a big deal. I didn't know that. The first job I did was in 1999 or 2000. And then the next year, my boss was like, hey, you got to go back onto those 2 jobs that we did with CO2 sensors, and you got to calibrate all those sensors. I was like, what? Why? He's like, well, you got to do it every year. I'm like, dude, there's like 50 sensors at each of those buildings. Like, why the hell did we do that? That's going to be a lot of work. Every time I got to go out there and recalibrate them, I'm like, geesh, that's going to be so much, right? And that's kind of how everybody felt. The sensors would drift a lot, and then they had to be constantly calibrated. That has been a non-issue for since maybe like 2005 or so, been a non-issue. All the manufacturers have what's called automatic baseline calibration, ABC logic. So they calibrate themselves, and almost all of them, at least the ones for commercial use, they're no longer can be calibrated. Like, we've removed the calibration buttons off the sensor. Because the problem was, what you normally had to do is hook up a can of gas to the inputs on the CO2 sensor, run your gas through it, basically zero it out, and then press the button to say you zeroed it out, right? Well, what happens is if people are hot and cold in a space, they start messing with everything they can. And they don't know that the CO2 sensor on the wall does not control temperature. They just know that there's a thing on the wall. Let's touch some buttons because I'm hot. And they'll pull the cover off, and they'll push that calibration button. It doesn't say calibrate, it's just a button. They push that button on the circuit board, and they just wiped out the reading on the CO2 sensor without having a can of gas connected to it. And then everything's all off. If there's a button, people are going to press it. If there's a switch, they're going to flick it. If there's a valve, they're going to open it. That's just what happens. When I go into a boiler room and things aren't working, the first thing I do is start touching stuff. Like, that's probably not the right way to do it, but I'm really going to go like, well, maybe they're not getting any flow to that radiator because this valve is shut. What the hell is this valve, this unlabeled valve do? Let me just turn it and see. Nope, that's not the right one. Shut it, shut it, shut it. That's what people do. So they will push the button when they shouldn't have. So there's no longer a calibration button on commercial grade sensors. They are not calibratable. You still would like to check them. So to somebody's question earlier, yeah, you would like to check the calibration maybe every year or two just to see if they drifted. Now, if you got 50 or 100 of these sensors, you don't have to check every year. Maybe you pick 10 and you go sample them. And if those 10 are all still kind of within range, probably the rest of them are. And next year you pick 10 different ones and do it, right? This is not like rocket science. If this thing's off by 50 parts per million, Remember, we're controlling a giant, huge mechanical damper with an old crappy actuator with broken linkage. If I'm reading 1150 parts per million instead of 1100 parts per million, that's not the end of the world. If it's off by a couple hundred, okay, that's gonna be a problem. It's got to be pretty close, right? Horseshoes and hand grenades kind of thing. The way the automatic calibration works, and by the way, there's like 2 manufacturers at this point that make what I call the CO2 engine that goes inside the plastic, right? So there's like 2 manufacturers, and they both have very similar technology. Even though there's like 15 manufacturers on the market, they're all using the guts from somebody else. So it works the same for pretty much everybody. I don't want to say it's a commodity, but it's kind of a commodity. So what ends up happening, if your building goes unoccupied at least 4 hours per week, total per week, not per day, per week, then we can do the automatic calibration. If you never go unoccupied, then we're gonna have to calibrate a lot, right? So if you're like, once again, the 911 call center, okay, they're always occupied 24/7, max occupancy. We gotta calibrate those guys. But then again, I told you that was a bad application for it anyway, because it's always occupied, right? So in normal buildings, we close at night. There's plenty of unoccupied times. What ends up happening for most buildings, in 4 hours, there's enough leakage in and out of the building that the building becomes the same parts per million as the outdoor air level when there's no people in there. And because the outdoor level doesn't change, the parts per million outside is always the same, or roughly the same, right? It changes over the decades, but it doesn't really change over the days and weeks. So it's roughly the same. So as long as we go unoccupied 4 hours a night, we just constantly keep tweaking that baseline to be back to what it is every single night. We keep recorrecting ourselves that way. All of these sensors do that, right? Here's 3 sensors sitting side by side for, looks like about a week, right? And they start out a little bit further apart. And then when my mouse is killing me today, man. Well, if I had a mouse, I would show you here, but it's going up and down, like there's a little bit of gap between the two. And they slowly keep gauging themselves towards each other till they're almost the same number over the course of the week. There's 3 sensors over the course of 2 weeks. There's 3 sensors over the course of 3 years. Just kind of hovering around that same number the whole time, keep recalibrating themselves. So reliability is actually pretty high nowadays. And the sensor cost is significantly lower. I mentioned all that stuff, right? We're going to make sure we get the right amount of ventilation, not have over-ventilation. Required by code, allowed by mechanical code, quick paybacks. And you don't have to calibrate them very often. The cost of these sensors has gone down dramatically. They're about a third of what they used to cost in the 1990s. So it's very feasible to do this on lots of projects now. Like I said, the paybacks are typically measured in months. In regards to COVID specifically, one of the recommendations was early on, back like in May, was to turn off your demand control ventilation routine, like pay your programmer to come in and disable it to get the overventilation on purpose, and then someday turn it back on. You don't need to do that. If you want to ventilate more, all you have to do is change your set point. Instead of leaving it at 1100 parts per million, just put it down like at 500 parts per million, something like that, and you'll get like the normal amount of ventilation there, kind of thing. You'll get a higher ventilation rate. You don't have to worry about its ability to keep heating and cooling, because whenever you do DCV, you always design the mechanical equipment to handle the peak day, which is the most amount of ventilation, assuming everybody's there. And then if they're not there, you throttle it back. So if for COVID you want to bump your CO2 set point higher, it'll allow your damper to open more, but not more than what would have been the code amount, just more than what you would have had on a partially occupied day. All right, let's see if we have any other questions that need to be addressed. Will asks, what monitoring system is feasible for showing that the economizer damper is working? We'll address that next Friday if you can join us then, using the FDD, Fault Detection and Diagnostics. So I'll talk about that specifically and in detail. Brian asks if the PowerPoint will be available. Yes, we can do that. If I forget, because I'm in the middle of this right now, send me a note and I'll remember to do that. How does the Ashrae code orientation have effect on DCV? Okay, we just answered that, so we probably typed it in before I answered it. All right, let's move on to ventilation. No, let's move on to filtration, a different shun. We'll do filtration, then we'll take like a 5-minute bio break or whatever, and then we'll go into the next topics. That'll be like the halfway point at that point. All right, so for filtration, right? If I want to catch stuff with a filter, the first thing I have to do is understand how big is the stuff that I want to catch, right? So this chart, specifically the green part, is going to tell me that. The units of measure here are microns, or also known as micrometers. So over here is 1,000 microns, which is a really, really small number, right? That's like the size of one piece of sand. And everything to the left gets smaller from there, right? So the big stuff like sand, hair, pollen, that stuff's pretty easy to catch with average filters. But if I want to catch small stuff, mold, bacteria, odors, dust, viruses, gases, that's going to be really hard to catch, right? And gases are almost impossible to catch because guess what else is a gas? Air. So if I have a filter that's really good at capturing gases, it's also really good at blocking all my airflow, which I cannot have, obviously. So I got to understand how big these things are. For those that don't like this chart, got a couple other ways to represent that to you. This right here is one of your hairs. And there's a different diameter of hair depending on how thick your hair is. But the kind of stuff we're trying to catch, like pollen, is significantly smaller than hair. And pollen is a big thing on this chart. So I want to catch stuff that I won't even see. That little white dot, whatever that is, I want to catch that. That's what I'm looking for here, right? So once again, like if I look at some of this stuff, like this is a piece, this is just a different way of looking at it. Here's a piece of sand. Here's a piece of hair. This blue thing is 10 micron particulate matter, and this red one is 2.5. Those two are on there because those are the two sizes of particulates that are often referenced in a lot of standards. How much of PM10 can you catch? How much of PM2.5 can you catch? COVID is 0.125. It's that little tiny ass dot right there, right? Where my red dot is, under there is COVID. It's super tiny, right? Here's PM10. Here's one of your red blood cells. Here's PM2.5. There's a little piece of bacteria. And then here's COVID-19. It's not this red thing, by the way. That's a blown up version. It's that little tiny dot. It's way smaller than bacteria and way smaller than your blood cells. It's super tiny. That's the bad news. The good news is, as far as viruses go, it's a big ass virus. Here's my original virus chart, and I put the COVID on here, which is like 0.1 something, right? It's way bigger than most viruses. It's like the size of a small bacteria. That's good news. It is literally going to be the easiest virus to catch of all the viruses I've ever tried to catch. It's still hard to catch, but it's going to be easier than other viruses. So I got a better chance of catching this than I have at catching like whatever, avian bird flu or something random like that, right? The way we can catch stuff with a filter, we have three types: mechanical, electronic, and chemical filters. For offices and schools and houses and stuff like that, we're not going to use chemical filtration. That's a whole nother category. We're shelving that discussion. We're not talking about that today. Just know that it exists for like process applications. You might use an electronic air cleaner. Commercially, these have never been popular. Residentially, they were very popular in the 80s and 90s. They no longer are. If you don't know how an electronic air cleaner works, it charges all of the air particles coming in. Let's just say, for argument's sake, it charges them positive. And then it's got these metal plates in there that are charged negative. And guess what? Opposites attract. The positive and the negative then go together, and all of your dust and debris and dirt collects on that plate. And that's great because that plate doesn't have very much pressure drop. It's really good at catching those things. It can catch really small things. The bad news is those plates have to be cleaned like every 3-4 weeks, because once the plates are covered in crap, that's it. They don't collect any more stuff. And nobody in America wants to clean anything. We want to throw stuff away. It's the same reason you don't use cloth diapers, right? Oh, it's better for the environment, right? It's great, fantastic. We don't waste stuff, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but I don't like cleaning poop off of everything. I don't like washing and laundering poo diapers. So I buy disposable ones, and then I throw them in the trash. Just kind of the way it goes. We're a disposable society. So yeah, you can use electronic air cleaners, and they do a good job as long as you clean them all the time. Or you can use a mechanical filter, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So mechanical filters have 4 ways to catch stuff, 4 different mechanisms they can use, and I'll touch on each one of these. The first one is impingement. So on these drawings, this blue circle is one fiber in my filter. So if I happen to have a filter made out of fiberglass, it's one little piece of fiberglass in there. If it's made out of that plastic mesh type stuff, it's one of those little strings, right? So one little fiber in the filter material itself. And my debris in this example is one piece of dust. So he comes flying down the airflow. He rams directly into the fiber, head-on collision, slams into the brick wall. Boom. He's impinged on the brick wall. That's it. Done. I caught him. That one's easy. Interception is a little bit different. I don't have a head-on collision. I have a glancing blow, right? So this is you driving on the expressway ramp, and there's that guardrail there, and you're not paying attention because you're like texting and all that kind of crap, and you hit the guardrail and you kind of grind along the side of it, your car is going to slow down, right? Friction is going to cause that to happen. And when two things are grinding on each other without new power being applied, which there's no new power in this case, that enough friction occurs, it'll come to a halt. So I didn't have a head-on collision. I had a glancing blow. I built up enough friction between the dust and the fiber that I'm kind of just stuck there. Straining is the one we all think of, right? The easiest way to think of this one is I have a pot of spaghetti and I have a strainer. I dump the spaghetti and water into the pot. The water is small, it fits through the holes. The spaghetti is fat, it doesn't fit through the holes. That's it. Same thing happens here. This dust tried to squeeze his little butt between two of the fibers. He doesn't fit. He's stuck. He's strained. He can't get through anymore. Right? And that's kind of what we normally think about in our heads for a filter anyway. Now the good news is when that dust piece clogs up that opening, the dust behind him and whatever other debris behind him tries to come along and they slam in the back of him and they all get stuck behind there. The dirtier your filter gets, the better your filter is at catching stuff. Like what? That doesn't make sense. Think about it, it does. If I load that filter up with dirt, other dirt can't fit through because it's like a brick wall at that point. The dirtier your filter is, the better of a filter it is. However, it doesn't allow airflow at some point, and that becomes a problem, which is why we have to change the filter and put a new one in. So I want to have my filter get as dirty as possible, catching as much stuff as possible until it's to the point where it can't move enough airflow, and then I would like to change it and put a new one in and start the process over. The fourth way is called diffusion, and this one is the hardest one to explain. So in this case, I switched it from dust to virus, something really, really, really small. Because really, really small things don't really move well with airflow or gravity for that matter, right? If you didn't know what gravity was, well, y'all know what gravity is. But gravity is the attraction. There's a force attraction between every object in the universe to every other object in the universe, right? If I have two things, if I have this hat and this spinner, they're attracted to each other, right? They have a force pulling them together, an invisible force. The Earth is an object, so it also has a force attracting everything to it. The more mass your object has, the more force it's going to have. So this spinner and this hat don't really pull towards each other. I mean, they are, but the force of gravity pulling on them is so much more powerful that this force is negligible. They're being pulled to the ground. If I let go of them, they'll fall to the ground, right? So it's a function of mass. But a virus is super tiny. It doesn't really have much mass. Sure, the Earth has a lot of mass, but this part of it, the other object, the virus, has very little. So viruses don't get pulled down to the ground. It's not like I can walk into a building, sweep the floor, wipe the counters, and all the viruses are gone. There's still viruses floating in the air. If they were heavier, they'd be pulled down on the counter, and when I wipe the counter up, they'd be gone. They'd be on the floor. When I vacuum, they'd be gone. But that's not the case. They just float around in the air, kind of do whatever the hell they want, because they don't really care about gravity that much. Additionally, they don't care much about airflow, right? If you have a sailboat, right? Let's say you got the pirate ship, right? You're driving around in your pirate ship. I got this big sail on here. The wind's behind me. It's pushing the sail along. If I drop the sails and there's only a mast sticking up there, yeah, sure, the wind's going to push on that mast and the back of the boat and move the boat a little bit, but not like what it did when the sail is up. So the smaller something is, the less likely airflow will push it along. It's got to be light, which is not a problem for the virus, and it's got to have a lot of surface area for the wind, for the breeze, for the room airflow to push it along. So it doesn't move very well with airflow. It will move with airflow, but not very well. Now, a lot of viruses, the reason they got in the room is because they came out of your face when you sneezed and coughed, which means they're entrained in water vapor, which means they are in fact bigger, which means they could move with the airflow for a while until they dry out, which is a function of the humidity of the room. And then they're going to be what I call a naked virus, meaning they don't have any vapor moisture on them. So now all of a sudden they're hard to get stuck in the airflow. The reason why we show it with a zigzag line on here is because there is a lot of movement in the space from small particles like viruses and things that are smaller. They follow what's called Brownian motion. So all the little tiny particles in the air are constantly hitting into each other and then shooting off in different directions. As they collide, they push away from each other and go flying around. Just like if you throw two baseballs in the air, the baseballs hit each other, they go shooting off in random directions. Not random directions, but into directions. The particles in the air are the same way. They're going to be bouncing all over each other. So they're going to be moving. They're just not going to move very well with airflow, and they're definitely not going to move downward with gravity. The point being is it's very hard to get them back to the filter. I might have a bunch of stuff in the air like viruses and gases and stuff, but getting them all back to the filter is a little bit of a challenge because they're going to be bouncing off each other. They will follow the airflow, just not very well and not as consistently as bigger things might, like like pollen, for example. But once they do eventually hit into the fiber, there is still the attraction of all the objects to each other in the universe, and that fiber and that virus have an attraction to each other, and the closer they get, the more powerful that becomes. So if he does come into contact with the fiber, he's very likely to stick on the fiber. Michael typed in incorrect explanation, but he didn't say what it was incorrect on, and I don't know what he said it on. So if you could clarify that, I'll try to go back and make a better explanation of what we're talking about. James asked, how does the Ashrae COVID recommendation on ventilation affect DCV? Okay, I think we answered that one already. Greg asked, do viruses move better in higher humidity? Yes, they do, because in higher humidity, because the virus starts out typically as coming from a person, coming from your bioeffluent, your breathing, your respiration, your sneezing, so there's moisture content to it. So the drier the room is, the sooner that moisture will evaporate. The more moist the room is, the longer it'll take for that moisture to mix and evaporate. So yes, the more humid the space is, the longer the virus will stay large because it has the moisture component, and the easier it will be to deal with. However, if the humidity gets too high, then I have other problems. Like other things come up, like mold growth and stuff like that. So I can't have it out of check. Towards the end today, we'll talk about some humidity specifically. Looks like Michael's clarifying his statement/question. You are somewhat correct with regard to why very small particles are not pulled down by gravity. You eventually got to Brownian motion, so more or less okay. So he commented before I was finished because he wanted more explanation, and I think we got it covered. So I think he and I are at least close to being on the same page at this point. Okay, gravity does have an effect, airflow does have an effect, but Brownian motion, things bouncing off each other, is a much bigger effect than both of those two. I think he and I are agreeing probably on that. When I select filters, there's many factors involved: the efficiency or the ability of the filter to catch stuff, the pressure drop penalty through it. I don't want a very restrictive high pressure drop filter, and now I can't move airflow through the dang thing. That's not going to help me, right? And how much CFM I can shove through it as well. There are two ways to test filters. One of them is extremely obsolete, Ashrae 52.1. That's been obsolete before I started in the industry for decades. Stop using that. If that's in your engineer spec, get it out of there. If there's anything in your spec that has the word % on it for a non-HEPA filter, get it out of there. The current standard is Ashrae standard 52.2, and that's what's called the Merv Rating standard. So all of your filters, with the exception of HEPA, that's different, but all of your other filters should have a Merv rating. If they don't have a Merv rating, that spec or that filter is significantly obsolete by decades. The way the Mirv test works, not that you would ever do this yourself, right? But for the filter manufacturers, the way they have it tested, they run air through an air handling system. They run it through a really, really, really good HEPA filter. Then they have a particle generator that squirts different sized particles into the air. They have a particle counter to count how many they squirted in. They run it through your filter that they want to test. Then they have another particle counter to see how many are left. Oh, we shot 100 in. Oh, there's only 3 left. We got 97% of those guys of that size particle. Now let's do it again with another size particle, and then another size one, and then another size one. And then the end result of that is going to be our Merv rating. This chart kind of explains that. The Merv rating scale goes from 1 to 16. Some people will incorrectly say it goes to 20 and say that 17 through 20 is for different versions of HEPA. Technically, HEPA filters are not covered under the current Ashrae 52.2 Merv rating system, but conceptually, if they were, they would be the 17 to 20 range. But there's a separate testing standard just for HEPA. So for discussion purposes, we'll pretend that HEPA is 17 through 20, but officially just know that it stops at 16. And then above that would be a different standard. So 1 through 16 is my Merv rating. 1 meaning it's the crappiest filter. It's basically my t-shirt. Like it's almost nothing, right? And then 16 being the high end of the scale. And then the size of particles that we can catch with that. If I go back to my particle sizes, right? Let's say I want to catch Well, let's do COVID because that's probably what you care about right now. What we said it was 0.125 was the micron size right here. So 0.125, I need to be down here. So I'd have to get a little bit finer detailed chart, but it's going to be like a Mirv 13 or 14 is what I'm going to need to catch something that small. If you look at the Ashrae recommendations, which came out in May, and then CDC, followed those as well. It was kind of weird the way it was first worded. It said the minimum Merv rating you need to be able to catch COVID is a Mirv 14, but if you can't handle that pressure drop, put in at least a Mirv 13, right? And like, well, which one catches it? What the hell, right? Well, Mirv 13 will catch some of it. If you remember, I said this test doesn't catch everything, right? It catches most of those particles, and you need to catch a certain amount to get the qualification. And that COVID is like right between the Mirv 13 and Mirv 14 number. So let's just make up some numbers for argument's sake. Let's say if you had a Mirv 13, you might catch 46% of the COVID coming through there. If you had a Mirv 14, you might catch 86%. You'll catch significantly more. But a Mirv 13 is certainly better than nothing, and certainly better than any of these other ones that are going to catch nothing. Most of the filters in your existing systems are probably like Mirv 8. That's pretty common. Mirv 16 is the minimum required by Ashrae 62.1, so you shouldn't have anything worse than that. But Mirv 8 is a pretty common one. Residentially, Mirv 8 to Mirv 10 is fairly common. But none of those are going to do anything for COVID or any of these small things. It's not going to do anything for really odors. It'll only get like half of your dust. Some of the dust over here, yeah. Some of the dust over here, no. Right? So it's not really that helpful. We'll go through a few more examples of that. When should you change these filters, right? Because I said airflow and pressure drop are a big deal. You should measure the differential pressure across the filter, compare it to the specs of that filter to know when to change it. A lot of people don't do that. At your house, you probably don't do that. I do that at my house. I actually have a system that monitors that, but I'm a little bit weird. But an average homeowner wouldn't. At a commercial building with a little rooftop or a furnace, they probably don't do that either. A big building with large air handlers like campuses, hospitals, universities, VAV systems at a school, those folks typically would. They would have a pressure sensor across the filter telling them when to change the filter. Now, whether that pressure sensor is set up correctly, that's a whole other discussion, but they probably have it there. There's lots of ways you can measure those pressure drops in the field with different tools, manometers, and so forth. Greg asked, do electronic filters have a Merv rating? They can have a Merv rating. They typically don't, but they can have a Merv rating. I don't think I have anything on my cheat sheets for electronic air filters. I've not seen anybody use a commercial electronic air filter in a couple decades. And residential, for the past 10 years, it's been very unpopular to the point where almost every manufacturer stopped making electronic air filters. Honeywell still has one model, and Air still has one model, but I think everybody else stopped making them. They're just not popular anymore residentially because people don't want to change, don't want to clean it. They're just lazy. I shouldn't say they're lazy. They just don't want to deal with it. I guess that's lazy. As far as the filters go, on commercial air handlers and large rooftops, you'll often see them in this V-bank configuration. The purpose of that is to get me more surface area. If you weren't aware, the CFM, the cubic feet per minute of air, if I write that out as a formula, right, cubic feet per minute is the area, feet squared, times the velocity, or the speed, if you want to think of it that way, the feet per minute, right? So feet per minute times the feet squared is my cubic feet per minute. So the area becomes a big factor. My CFM isn't going to change. I suck a certain amount of airflow into the air handler. A certain amount of airflow is going to go out of the air handler. Unless my air handler is leaky, that's what's going to happen. So that's fixed. So if I want to slow down the air, and I definitely want to slow down the air, because if I have air coming through the filter at a high speed, it'll have a lot of velocity pressure. It's kind of like if you take a spitball and put it in a straw, right? You blow really hard on that, your mouth going through that straw is going to create a lot of velocity pressure. Velocity is speed plus direction. So I have a lot of speed and direction in that going down that tube with the straw, and that gets converted to velocity pressure, which will shove that spitball way out of there, right? But if I put that spitball in a very large tube instead of a small straw, I'm not going to be able to generate that velocity pressure because there's more surface area to work with. So we put this V-bank in to get more surface area, because if I can increase the area, that will decrease the velocity, right? Because the CFM has to stay the same. I want the slow velocity because it's going to be easier for me to catch stuff on the filter. If I have high velocity, I'll have high velocity pressure, and I'll be able to shove the dirt through the small holes. If I have low velocity, it'll get caught on the filter and not get as easily shoved through the holes. So put in this V-bank pattern, because I'd like to have it be like really tall. I'd love for your duct system to come into the mechanical room like this, go to some really large, wide section of duct, where my filter's at, to slow down the velocity pressure. But you're not going to give me a 20-foot tall mechanical room. That's just not going to happen. So instead, we put the filter in this V-bank fashion, because if you were to stretch that V-bank out, it would be like I had a big tall section temporarily. So as the air goes through that filter section, it has a slower velocity just for that little moment of time. And that's what I need to happen. I need to keep this like 500 feet per minute or less. Both the filter section and the cooling evaporator coil, I'm kind of pretty much capped like 500, 550 feet per minute of velocity, or bad things happen. Bad things in the filter means I can't catch small stuff. Bad things on the evaporator coil means the water blows off the coil. I have enough velocity pressure to throw the water off the coil and slam it into the electrical section of the fan, which I don't want to happen. I need to slow it down, and V-banks are one way to get that done. Another way to get that done, I don't have a good example on here, do I? No. I should put a picture on here. I didn't do that. You can't really see on these ones, but there's pleated filters, right? So a pleated filter, if I draw a crappy drawing of it, I should put a better picture on here. Inside the actual filter, inside this cardboard holder of the filter, the media goes like in a pattern like that, all right? So we call that a pleated filter. It's basically like putting those little V-banks into the actual filter. So on small equipment, I'll have pleated I will want to put pleated filters in to get that surface area to do a better job of catching stuff. Or even on big equipment, I could put pleated filters in and have the V-bank and have both of those things working in my favor. A lot of systems get one of these cheap low-end filters that either don't have a Merv rating or they're really poor Merv ratings. If your filter looks like one of these filters, your filter doesn't do anything as far as germs are concerned. Your filter's there for the reason that we started putting filters in equipment to begin with. If you didn't know, the reason that HVAC has filters is not to make your air quality better. We don't care about you and your air quality. I mean, we do, right? But that's not why the filter's there. The filter's there to keep dirt off of the heat exchanger, to keep dirt off the evaporator coil, because if those things get dirty, they don't transfer heat very well, and then you don't get warm and cold like you want to. So that's why I put the filter there. Nowadays, more modernly, we'd also like the filter to catch germs. That would be great if we can do both. This filter can't do both. This is a crappy filter. I would use this kind of filter only in one of two scenarios. One, it's construction time. They're still building the building out. There's drywall dust and crap like that I want to catch. But I don't want to put the good filter in yet because that thing's expensive. So I'll put these cheap ones in temporarily. Or two, I will put one of these cheap ones in as a pre-filter to catch all the big stuff. And I'll have my good expensive filter after that. And that way I don't have to change him as often. He'll last longer because the big, good, expensive filter can spend his time catching small things because this sacrificial lamb upstream caught the big things. Lisa says those filters all look so clean. Yeah, these pictures are all of new filters. Michael says an alternate way of looking at it is that angling the filters, the horizontal path links through the filter are increased by 1 over the cosine of the angle off. Thank you for your information, Michael, but I forgot all my trigonometry, and so did everybody else. You're way more advanced than the rest of us on your math skills. But don't worry, my high school daughter is now a freshman, so I'll be relearning trigonometry with her soon and fighting the whole time. So those are those simple panel filters. You can also have panel link filters. Those are not very common anymore. You can have roll filters. You're never going to see these. I've only seen it once ever. The idea was it was self-cleaning. It had a little motor. It would pull a new section of filter across it whenever the pressure drop got high. It's a nice idea, but the motors would die out over time and people would forget about them. It's just a reason to neglect your system. Nobody uses that anymore. Bag filters are pretty common for high-end air handlers, hospitals, and stuff like that. It basically looks like a bunch of grocery bags hanging off of the end here, right? And that's kind of what it's like, except the grocery bags are made out of like fiberglass or something like that. And that gets me a lot of surface area. So it's another way to get a lot of surface area. This depth is typically like 12 inches. So I get a ton of surface area compared to, say, a pleated filter. You can't go throwing that in your furnace at your house or even a rooftop. It's got to be an air handler, that's designed for that amount of space. But you can do pretty good with that. If you're trying to prevent a lot of bypass around the filter, right? Because if I put a bunch of these filters in, like 5 of them in a row, and the next guy's over here, how tight is that gap? Not very tight. And if there's a gap there, air is going to leak by it. So when you get to really important jobs, you'll start having things that have cartridges that have very hard cardboard cartridges, or in this case, metal cartridges. So I can put them very close to each other and even caulk in between them to make sure I don't have any leakage past them. And HEPA filters are always going to be like that because I can't have any. They're so restrictive from a pressure drop standpoint. I can't have any bypass around them. It's got to have all the airflow go through them. So we'll caulk them and seal them up. Just to give you an idea, right? So this is bag filters. If there's a gap there, air is going to go through the pass of least resistance. Why would I go through the bag when I can go through the gap, right? So I need to get rid of the gaps. And if it's cartridges and HEPAs and stuff like that, I will even caulk the gaps up. The more important the project, the more time I'm going to spend getting these filters in correctly. If it's just like, some insignificant, normal, everyday office building, I'm not caulking all the filters. If this is a surgical suite, I'm absolutely caulking all the filters, right? And I'm going to have multiple filters. I'll have pre-filters, then I'll have the regular filter, then I'll have a post-filter, right? I'll have tons of filtration there. Greg asks, are the Merv values additive? If you have a Merv 8 and another Merv 8, does that equal Merv 16? It does not. That's actually a good question. No one's literally ever asked me that, but it's a great question. It is not additive. The Merv rating, if I just go back real briefly here, the Merv rating is a function of how small of things I can catch, not how many times I've tried to catch them. So if I have a Merv 8 filter, he can only catch stuff down to 3 to 10 microns. So basically some stuff smaller than 3 will fit through the hole, right? So that means everything from here down fits through the hole. Well, if it fits through the hole in the first filter, it's going to fit through the hole in the second filter, right? So no, it's not additive. A Merv 8 plus another Merv 8 equals Merv 8. You don't get any. You don't even get to Merv 9. You don't even get one extra. It's the exact same thing. The only thing it does is it keeps the second filter pretty clean, right? You don't get anything extra. There are ways to increase the Merv rating of a filter through ionization, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on today. But 2 filters isn't going to do it. You might still want 2 filters, one cheap one to catch the big stuff, and one good one after that to catch the little stuff. If you don't have the ability to add filters, there are products out there that you can do filtering in just the room. This was not very popular until like a year ago. And then one of you guys typed a question in about the schools that don't even have ventilation, right? They might not even have an air handler. They might just have a baseboard heater, no cooling, no ventilation, and they have radiators or baseboard heaters, and that's it, because the school was built in 1953, and that's what they got, right? Well, how am I going to put good filters in on something that doesn't even have a fan and airflow? I can't. So other than retrofitting the whole school, one thing you can do is bring a portable air filtration system in and put it in the actual room. There are dozens of these on the market. There's probably 50 of these on the market. Like 40 of them are small, residential, one-room use type things. Don't bother putting that in your classroom. Yeah, it says it can cover like 1,000 square feet. 1,000 square feet at your living room with 3 people, not in your classroom with 30 people. You're going to need to move way more airflow. So if you're going to do it for like a classroom or a dentist office or something like that, get a commercial grade unit. Yes, it's going to cost you, I don't know, $1,500 instead of $400. Yes, that's going to happen. But in order for those little tiny ones, those tabletop ones to do it, you probably would have had to buy 4 or 5 of them to get the job done. So you might as well just buy the big commercial one. But just know that those are out there. Basically, it looks like a residential furnace or residential fan coil, because it kind of is. And instead of putting a cooling section in there, right, and a heat or a gas heat exchange section in there, they put a HEPA filter in there. So it's basically a fan, a pre-filter, and a HEPA filter on wheels with an extension cord. That's what it is, right? And there's several of these on the market that you can use if you have a system that can't move any airflow. So typically, hydronic systems that don't have any cooling is typically where this comes up the most. If you got a cooling system, you probably have a duct system, and you probably can do it a different way. You can use those kind of equipment as negative pressure machines where they suck air out of the room, filter it, and discharge it outside. So like in an ICU area, that might be the case. Or you can just use it as a recirc machine to enhance whatever it is you already have going on in the space. All right, if we're having trouble catching these small things, and we will, right? So we have different kinds of, this is a similar kind of chart, all the bad things, right? small stuff over here, medium stuff over here, big pieces of debris over here, right? The better my filters get, the more and more smaller things I can catch. But there's going to be a whole category of things that I can't catch, even with a HEPA filter. It's going to be really tough to do that. Some of these really, really small things are probably going to pass through the HEPA filter. So I'm going to use what's called an air purifying filter, or I might use a regular filter plus an air purifier. A couple different ways we can do that. It is 9:46, 9:47. Let's take a 5-minute break so you guys can hit the bathroom, or mainly so I can hit the bathroom. You guys could have got up and did that whenever you wanted. Let's take a 5-minute break. We'll come back at 9:52, and we will resume our discussion with air purifying filters and air purifiers. All right. We are back in business. I assume everybody can hear me. If one or two of you could type something in so I know the sound is good, I will begin proceeding. There was a couple of questions that came in. Can you guys hear me? Sound is good? Someone say something. All right, cool. Thank you guys. Appreciate it. You guys just type slow, that's all. William asked, what's a good particle counter to measure 2.5 particulate matter in a classroom? There's 3 different ones that some of the guys in my office use. I just went and grabbed one off of another presentation and threw it on this screen. But a couple guys in my office use this one. I don't have this one. The one I have, I'll show you at the end today, is a lot less expensive and a lot more simplified, and it connects to my phone, so I'm kind of lazy. But a lot of guys in my office use this one. A lot of guys, meaning 2 guys, have this particle counter. And this one is nice because it's better than the one I have. The one I have does PM10 and PM2.5, which are the 2 common ones to look at. But this one, I don't know if you can see the screen or not, it does 10, 5, 2.5, 1, 0.5, and 0.3. So they can use it to read some pretty low stuff. So the guys in my office that have that, they're typically the ones dealing with hospitals and stuff like that, whereas I typically deal with more normal buildings. So you can definitely use that one. This one's from X-Tech. There's also one guy in my office that has this one. Let me get rid of this other screen here. That has this one here, which is from Secure Air. So we have one of those in our office as well. It only does the 2 normal ones, 2.5 and 10. And then I'll show you the one I have at the end of the day today because it's on my last slide. And I'll show you that one too. Okay, so air purifying technology. There's a bunch of these type of things out there. This particular one, and I don't really care about any specific manufacturers today. I'm just trying to be, generic with you guys. But I'm going to keep using different manufacturers' examples, like I used that Carrier OptiClean a minute ago, because those are the ones I happen to have information on and I've used before, kind of thing. So this Secure Air one is just one manufacturer out there. My company, which is not based in the Northeast, we're in the Midwest, so we don't compete with anybody out there, so it shouldn't affect anybody. But we use Secure Air because we've been using them since 2013, and we specifically started using them for hospital applications, where we want to get near HEPA filtration. Now, some areas need HEPA filtration, like the operating suite, and I get that. But other areas, like the regular lobby areas, the patient rooms, stuff like that, we don't need HEPA, right? But we also want to get like a Merv 13, 14, 15 level of filtration, but we want to pay for the fan energy associated with that. So the reason we have this particular solution is it has high filtration, Merv 15, but it has like Merv 10, 11 type pressure drops, which saves a lot of electrical energy. That's literally why we have this. Coincidentally, it also happens to do a good job of what I would say would be killing viruses. The guys at Secure Air are very much more scientific than me. Like, no, Ryan, you can't kill the virus because it's not actually alive. We inactivate the virus. Okay, inactivating the virus, but killing sounds better. They make a portable version, similar to that Carrier one I showed you before, but theirs is different technology. And they make all these duct-mounted ones that go in air handlers. And then about, I want to say 15 months ago, they started doing residential as well, like just in time for COVID, almost like they planned on COVID coming or something. So they're really good at catching small particles. They don't really care what the particle is. They even they even treat bacteria and viruses as really small particles, because everything's a particle. Everything that has any mass associated with it is a particle. And if we can catch a 0.1 micron particle, and that particle happens to be a virus, okay, great, got it, right? So they're good at catching really small stuff. And I won't. This is kind of a duplicative slide of what I showed you before, but I'll just throw them all up there at once. A lot of the things that we're trying to catch are really small things, right? Everything below the green line is less than 0.1 micron. So COVID is just like barely above the green line, if you will. And a lot of the stuff we want to catch, like the flu, is smaller than that. Cold virus, smaller than that. Measles, smaller than that, right? All those other things are really small. COVID's kind of on the bigger side, if you will. One of the bigger viruses, as I already told you. So the way that their technology works is they have a couple steps to it. So all the air coming into the air handler gets conditioned, which means that it gets electrically charged, if you will. So we're going to give a charge to that air coming in, And we're going to charge some particles one way, positive, and some particles another way, negative. And then the positive and negative things are going to want to do what? They're going to want to collide into each other, attach to each other, because positive and negatives attract. Well, when a bunch of things, 3, 4, 5 things clump together because of electrical forces, they're now basically one big thing. And when they get over to the filter section, now instead of catching a really small thing, I'm catching a medium small thing. Makes it a lot easier to catch it if it's bigger. That's literally the main premise of their technology. They don't actually kill anything, and there's some technology that will, and we'll show you that. They don't actually kill it. They just do a really good job capturing it, right? And then they'll inactivate it, right? Well, I guess for bacteria and mold they kill it. For viruses they inactivate it. That whole speech again. But they charge the particles, collide them together, and then they can capture them on the actual filter. Now, some of those things when they go through the filter might still be too small to get caught by the filter. That's okay. They go out into the space then, which is where they came from anyway. They go back out into the space, but they still have charge associated with them. And now they attract to other things in the space that happen to coincidentally have a charge, because a lot of things in the space are charged one way or the other. And they clump those things together. So they make the germs and the particulates in the room bigger, which means they're more likely to follow the rules of gravity and fall down to the ground where they can be swept up, or more likely to have surface area where they can be swept up into the airstream more easily. So that whole thing we said before, where small things like a virus don't care a lot about airflow and gravity, and Brownian motion is a bigger deal. Well, once I make those small things in the room bigger things, now all of a sudden gravity and airflow become a bigger part of their lives, and less interesting than Brownian motion would have been. So that's the premise of this technology. Charge the stuff so it's bigger so we can capture it, and if we don't capture it, let those same things, good and bad particles, by the way, the good and bad stuff, we're charging everything and capturing everything. We don't even know what the things are. We're just capturing them all. But if those things don't get stuck in the filter, they go through the space and proactively bring other stuff back to the filter with them. So this is not a reactive filter like a normal filter would be, or even like a HEPA would be. HEPA has to wait for something to happen. It's a great filter, but somebody's got to deliver the particulate to the filter. This guy not only captures stuff, but he delivers the particulate back. Secure Air is not the only manufacturer that does something like this. The other one I know of is Stryon Air. They do the same kind of thing, and there could be a couple more out there. But just want to know it's proprietary technology, but other people have similar technologies. In fact, most of the guys that work at Secure Air used to work at Stryon Air at some point, so there's some similarities. But it's separate patents, technically separate ways of doing it. So they test this filter as an assembly, the charging mechanism and the filter media itself, and it's rated for Merv 15. Right? And if you remember, the scale goes from 1 to 16, and then after that you'd be in HEPA land. So it's one notch below the top Merv rating that they could have gotten. It doesn't have very much pressure drop, 0.28 inches. That's pretty low, and compared to most systems like at a hospital, and compared to a HEPA that might have 1 or 1.5 inches of static pressure drop, it's pretty low. So that means it doesn't take a lot of fan energy to do this, as compared to other technologies that get you a Merv 15. And then the stuff that gets caught on the filter is basically getting electrocuted to death by that charging mechanism. I don't know what the voltage is on this one, but I have a similar technology at my house from Stryon Air, although it's rebranded as Carrier. And that one charges 18,000 volts through all the germs on my filter. It's 18,000 volts at low amperage, so I could stick my hand in there and grab it. I mean, it would be a really bad day if I did that, but I probably wouldn't die. But if I'm a single cell organism, meaning I only have one cell like bacteria and viruses, and something electrocutes me, that's it, it's over. My hand, I'll kill a bunch of skin cells, they'll get burned, right? But if I only have one cell like a virus, it's game over, right? If anybody has any questions, type them in as we go. Otherwise, we're going to keep plowing through different technologies on here. These typical units are typically going to, these air filters are typically going to go in custom and semi-custom air handlers. You're not going to squeeze something like this into like an existing rooftop unit, for example. This is going to be an air handler for a project, and you're going to have a whole grid of these things in there, and it'll be designed and laid out to match up with whatever your air handler dimensions are. Stephen asked, does Ashrae approve of the technology? Ashrae doesn't approve any technologies. That's not something that Ashrae would do. They don't approve brands and manufacturers and things like that. So the things I'm showing you now, like these air purifying filters or air purifiers that I'm going to show you later on, won't have an approval or a disapproval from Ashrae. They just won't be addressed. Ashrae is going to make recommendations for things, and the two things that Ashrae recommends all the time, pre and post COVID, are going to be outside air, ventilation air for dilution purposes, and it's going to be filtration. So Ashrae will make recommendations on what kind of Merv ratings you should have, but they're not going to tell you what technology has to get you to that Merv rating, if that makes sense. So these are just some pictures of this kind of stuff. We'll kind of plow through that. One of the nice things about some of these kind of filters too, that use both electrical and filter media in conjunction with one another, is that the filters can last longer. For example, like I said, I have a similar technology at my own home, and my filter's been in for 4 years, and I've changed it 4 times, right? Yeah, 4 times now. The first time it was 13 months, then 9 months, then 11 months, then 15 months. I change it based on pressure drop. But mine lasted basically on average a year. Whereas my old filter, I might have had it changed 3 times in 1 year. My old one was a Mirv 10, no, Mirv 11, I think it was. So my new filter has a higher Merv rating, but I change it less often. And sometimes that can be the case. Typically, the deeper the filter gets for a given Merv rating, the more space it can load stuff on. So the more pleats it has, if you will, the more space it can load stuff on, and hence the lower the pressure drop, and the longer the filter will last. So if you want to put in a Merv 13 in a 1-inch filter, that's going to be a problem. It's going to have a really high pressure drop. It's probably going to cause your system to trip on high limit due to lack of airflow. So if you want to get high Merv rating, meaning more than Merv 10, you better start getting a deeper filter, a 3 or 4-inch filter on there to get that depth on there. Steven says, I thought they approve of UV lighting. UV lighting is a recommendation from Ashrae to control microbials, and we'll talk about UV lighting here in a minute. Control microbials on evaporator coils, and has been for a long time. But Ashrae will not then go and tell you what kind of UV lighting to use. They won't say use UVC or use UVV. They'll just say ultraviolet germicidal irradiation is effective at killing bacteria and so forth on evaporator coils. So it's the same kind of thing with the filters. They'll tell you what to do, but not which technology to get it done with. We have lots of different kinds of UV lights we can use, and Ashrae won't say one or the other. They'll just say, yeah, UV light is going to kill certain things in general. Just like filters are going to catch certain size things, but we don't know what kind of filter you're going to do to get there. But if you want to get high Merv rating, you probably need a thick filter. Okay, so we talked about that stuff. If you're restricted and you can only put in small stuff, there are ways. There's 2 examples here to get 1 and 2-inch filters. This company is called Respicare. There are other manufacturers as well. Once again, I'm just using examples of people that I've worked with before, but there are plenty of them out there. They have 1 and 2-inch filters that fit into standard rooftops and standard residential systems even that have fairly low pressure drop, and they have a filter media, that's the white part on here, and an electrical component working together. This particular one is 1-inch, and it can get up to Merv 13. It doesn't go as high as these other guys did, right? Because it doesn't have as much depth to work with. But I could still get Merv 13 in a 1-inch, which might work for my rooftop because I only got 1 inch to work with. So there's ways to kind of get some of that stuff done if you need to. All right, UV light, someone had mentioned. Ultraviolet germicidal irradiation is the generic term, right? So that would be the way Ashrae would refer to it. There are lots of UV light technologies that can be used. The ones that we're going to use the most are UVC and UVV. Not that you can't use the other ones, but they're not going to have a big effect at killing stuff. All of these are just bands of light. If you didn't know, light travels in waves, and the nanometers we're talking about here is the length of each wave, right? So if I go from peak to peak, how many nanometers of distance would that be? Most of these things are also coming from natural sources like the sun. Our atmosphere blocks a lot of these, but we're going to reproduce some of these in the air handling system for the purpose of killing stuff, right? Or in the case of viruses, inactivating because we can't kill them, yada, yada, yada. You can tell that kind of really bothers me, right? So this is not new technology. This has been around literally since the 1950s. This is old school stuff, but it still works. UV light breaks down the DNA and the RNA of various organisms. And if you're a single cell organism, 1 cell, and it gets messed up, game over, right? So I can go outside and have the sunlight shining on my skin, that, UVB light shining on my skin, and it's going to burn the skin cells on my arm. It's going to kill them. They're going to be dead, right? They're a single cell organism. They got smoked. They're dead, right? But fortunately for me, I got a lot of skin cells underneath those, so Ryan, I'm still good. But if I only have one cell total in my life and it gets broken down, that's it, game over. So UV light is really good at killing single cell organisms. But just like with the sun, I need a lot of shine time. If I walk outside, if I roll my sleeves up and I walk outside right now, it's sunny outside where I'm at. Hopefully it's sunny by you too. I walk outside to grab something out of my car and I walk back in, my skin cells aren't dying. I wasn't in the sun long enough. But if I go sit out there for 4 hours, right? Yeah, my skin's going to start burning or it's going to tan, which is still the same kind of general effect. It's damaging the skin cells. So I need a lot of shine time, or I need a really intense source. So I'm over here at whatever, 600 feet above sea level. If I go to the top of a mountain, 20,000 feet above sea level, right? Maybe the sun will have a bigger effect on me up there. Right now, I'm gonna be so cold, I'll be bundled up with a parka, so it won't matter. But if I was standing up on top of, Mount McKinley naked, then I guess maybe I would burn sooner than I would if I was in a valley somewhere, right? I need a lot of intensity and time. Well, the good news is that's actually a measurable thing. It's a defined, known thing. We used to always just call it the kill dose, but more properly, it's called the CT value. The kill dose or CT value is the intensity of the UV energy source, light bulb, sunlight, whatever, times the time I spend underneath the source. So how much time of exposure do I have? There's a unit of measure for that. It's microwatt seconds per centimeter squared. You don't have to memorize that. That won't be on the test. Just know that there's a unit of measure. And for each bad thing, each germ, we know through research and testing how many microwatt seconds per centimeter squared I need to have in order to kill that thing. One of the other things to think of is how far I get away. Like I said, if I'm up on the top of a mountain or if I'm in a valley, the intensity will be less. So this is in my air handler. This blue thing is my UV bulb. If I define 1 inch away from the bulb as full power, if I get 2 inches away, I've lost 75% of its killing power. And if I get 8 inches away, I've lost 98%, meaning I only have 2% left to kill with. The further you get away, the less power there's going to be. Most UV bulbs, they're listing for microwatt seconds per centimeter squared. Ooh, it's a mouthful. Most of them are listed at the 1 foot distance, 12 inches away. This slide is from Residio, which is Honeywell. And this is for one particular model they have, and their bulb is 600 microwatts per centimeter squared. I'm going to stop saying the units of measure because it's too hard for me. It's 600 at 1 foot away. I went to look to see what other bulbs I could find out in the market, and it seems like this is a simple residential bulb. A lot of bulbs happen to also be like around 800. So in my examples later, I'll use 800. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt that you have a really good bulb. And then the folks at Honeywell were nice enough to provide me this chart with all the bad stuff, right? So I went and got the actual source of that bad chart, which is actually readily available, and I can give that to anybody who needs it. There's a link from the American Air and Water Association that has it all on there. And this particular chart, I got bacteria on the left. Over here on the right, I got molds and viruses and a few other things. There's 2 columns for each one. 90% reduction, which means 10% of the bad thing survives. 99% reduction, which means 1% survives. And then for some stuff, you can also find data for 99.9% kill rate, meaning 0.1 survives, right? But most of the time, if we can get 99% of it, we're feeling pretty good about ourselves. And as you can see, looking at some of these, I don't know how well you guys can see the screen just with this size. I'll give you blown up examples in a minute. But it's a wide range of stuff. Whatever this thing is, only takes 1,300. This thing takes 24,000. This one only takes 1,000. The really wide variance and how hard it is to kill certain things. So I'm going to take a couple examples here. I'm going to use a bulb that has 800 at 1 foot away, right? So that's my intensity of my bulb and what it was rated at. I'm going to pick something on here, Bacillus subtilis, whatever that one was. It doesn't sound great, right? But it takes 11,600 to knock it down 90%. Okay, if I take that and I multiply it out, right, by my bulb that does 800, I'm going to need 14.5 seconds of shine time at 1 foot distance to kill 90% of that germ. If I take influenza down over here, I need 3,400 to kill 90%. I need 6,600 to kill 99. So let's go with that. Influenza is fairly easy to kill. I need 6,600. Divide that by my bulb, 800. I need 8 seconds of shine time at a 1 foot distance to kill 99% of the flu coming through my air. Well, I'm usually at 500 feet per minute at the point where these bulbs are installed, which is typically the evaporator coil area. I'm at 500 feet per minute there. If I go down the duct is smaller dimension, so the velocity would be more, so this would be even worse. The coil is where the air is going to be the slowest, so that's my best chance of killing it because I'll be near the bulb longer. In order for me to get 8 seconds of shine time at a 1 foot distance, I'm going to have to bathe the airflow for 66 feet, putting a bulb every 2 feet to get that much shine time to kill influenza, 99% of it on the first pass. Well, I don't have 66 feet to work with, and I'm not going to buy 33 bulbs to put them in 66 feet of ductwork. That's just not happening. So it's going to be very difficult for me to kill bacteria and flu and stuff like that in the air. Now, if I'm the bulb manufacturer, the first thing I'm going to say right now is, and by the way, my company sells UV bulbs, so I'm not bashing it by any means. I'm just telling you like what it does from a technology standpoint. The first thing I'm going to say is, well, yeah, that's on the first pass. If I only had one bulb, it goes past there, it gets a little bit killed. And the next time it comes back to the airline system, we kill it a little bit more and a little bit more. And on the 12th time, he's dead. Okay, that's true. Not false in any way. My argument is I was kind of lucky to get this little virus back to the bulb to begin with. What are the chances I get him sucked back in the air handler 8, 9, 10, 12 times, right? He doesn't care about the airflow motion that much. So for the fact that I even got him to the air handler was kind of a blessing. How am I going to get him back 10 times, right? So it's not a super good argument in my mind. Not bashing UV lights. We sell them. They have great purposes. I'll show you some of the great purposes. But just don't make the assumption that the UV bulb is going to do a lot for killing germs in your space. Now, there is what's called upper room UV bulbs that you can put in a space. You've probably seen them like in operating rooms and stuff. They go up by the ceiling, they shine up at the ceiling, and they try to kill any germs that are in the upper half of the room. They don't shine down because then you would get, sunburn and your eyes would hurt and all that. But they try to kill some stuff in the room, and that's a little bit different. But I'm trying to kill stuff in the air by putting a bulb in your air handler, and it's going to be pretty challenging to do that. Now, if you want to look at COVID, we can do that. It wasn't on these charts because when these charts were made, COVID was kind of new, I guess you would say. It still kind of is. So the best thing I could find on COVID was some research data that showed me the dose rate needed. It says predicted because this is not final data, so we'll just keep that in mind. We'll just use it and pretend that it is for the discussion purposes. It tells me the UV source that I need in microwatt seconds per centimeter squared and my percent survival rate, right? So 10% of the virus survives, meaning 90% is gone. 99% killed, 1% is left. Those same two numbers we had before. And since COVID is very easy to kill relative to, say, flu, and I already told you flu is easy to kill, let's go down to the 0.1, meaning 99.9% of it's neutralized and only 0.1% survived. I need just 2730 microwatt seconds per centimeter squared to do that. So it's going to be pretty easy to kill COVID compared to the bacteria or compared to the flu that we just looked at. But even still, when I do the math on that guy with an 800 bulb, which is a pretty common bulb, I'm still going to need 28 feet of bulb spaced out every 2 feet so they can each kill within 1 foot. That's going to be like 14 bulbs. It's still not practical. I'm still not doing that. It's just not feasible to do it. So what the hell is a UV bulb really good for? It's really, really good at killing germs on stuff that doesn't move. Air moves, so it's not really good at that. It can do it, it's just not really good at it. There's a lot better ways to do it that I'll show you. But a evaporator coil, a cooling coil, it's great at killing germs on that. That coil is not moving. It's there for life. It's locked down. It can't move. So if it takes me 3 days of shine time, fine. It doesn't matter. Once I kill all the germs on there, then I'm good. Then I'm just like in maintenance mode. I'm just killing the new germs. If I took this dirty coil on the left and I put a UV bulb on it, it would eventually look like the coil on the right. Now, I'm not going to do that because it's going to take months for that to happen, right? It's got to kill all the stuff on this. Then as that coil heats up and cools down, it'll expand and contract. The stuff will get brittle. It'll flake off, and I can kill the stuff under it and repeat that process. Well, the two problems with that are, one, the stuff flaking off is going to clog up my drain pan. That's not good. And two, if I just sold the customer a clean coil, that's what I sold to them, and it still looks like that, they're going to be grossed out. So I need to manually clean the coil and then use the UV bulb to keep it clean. It's more of a maintenance type thing. That is the absolute best use for the UV bulbs. Cleaning coils and keeping coils clean. We don't have time. We go through a whole discussion on how far and how much you need to space these UV bulbs in order to get enough coverage rate. Like residentially, one stick bulb pretty much does it. But when you get to larger commercial air handlers and the air handler is 8 feet wide, right, I'm going to need larger and larger bulbs. I'm going to need ones up high and ones down low in order to get enough shining ability on the coil. If I just had this one bulb here in the middle, he's not really going to shine on anything up there or anything on the bottom. So there's rules, and each manufacturer has charts for this kind of stuff on how much height a bulb can handle at how far distance away. And the further you put it away, the more height it can handle, but you only got so much room to work with, and then you're in the next section of the air handler, so that's not feasible either. In addition to keeping gross things from growing on your coil, like bacteria and mold, it also keeping the debris off your coil makes it better for heat transfer, because if my coil's dirty, now the coil has to heat up or cool down the stuff, the mold, let's say, and then the mold has to heat the air. That takes longer, so it runs my compressor longer. And then additionally, it's harder to push air through a coil that has stuff growing on it. So in the interest of time, and these slides are available if anybody wants them, I actually stole these slides from Sterile Air, which is not even a company I work with. They just do a good job of explaining stuff. But these slides are all here to kind of show you the increase in airflow and the decrease in pressure drop by keeping coils clean and better temperature differential. Somebody typed in a question, but it's so long I gotta blow up my screen to see it. Let me see what Brian put in. We've gone crazy at my job adding UV lights to as many buildings as possible. I didn't agree with this approach, but was outvoted. My question, where should the bulb be inserted? Intake or exhaust, depending on the amount of outdoor air, of course. The bulb should only go on the evaporator coil. There is no benefit to putting it on the return ever, because on the return, think about this. When you're in economizer mode and you're bringing in free cooling, all the return air is leaving the building. So why are you even trying to clean return air if it's going to leave the building, right? So definitely not on the return side of the air handler, definitely on the supply side. You're going to want to put it in the air handler because the dimensions of the air handler are wider than the dimensions of the duct. Therefore, the velocity is slower, which is going to help me. Plus, I want it to mainly shine on the coil because that's what it's going to do the most work at. Will it kill the germs in the air that go by it? Sure, it'll work on killing those germs too, but that's not his main job. His main job is killing germs on the coil. So definitely on the coil. I personally like to have it on the inlet side of the coil because my mentality is, well, the germs are coming from the inlet. The debris is coming from the inlet. So let's just kill it right away. Why let it get on the coil and then try to kill it? Let's just kill it as it's coming into the coil. All right. The other argument might be to put it on the discharge side of the coil because that's where the drain pan is at. And now I can have it shining on the drain pan. Now in residential, we typically have an A coil above the furnace, and putting it on the inlet side of the coil is the same side as the drain pan. So for residential and small systems that have a blow-through fan setup, putting it on the inlet side of the coil, discharge side of the fan, works best because then I can kill on the coil and on the drain pan. On a commercial air handler, if I have a draw-through style coil, so a larger air handler, then I'm probably going to want to put the bulb on the discharge side of the coil because that's where the drain pan also happens to be. All right, moving on. We got another half an hour to cover 80 things. There are some technologies out there that have UV lights in them that are not used for killing stuff on the coil. They're specifically used for killing stuff in the air. But they work very, very differently than what I just described. What I just described was the light of the bulb shining on something to kill those germs with the UV light being the killing factor, right? What I'm going to talk about now is using a UV light, but not using it as a killer. It's going to be used as a catalyst so something else can be the killer, right? It seems weird I'm having a presentation about killers, probably get arrested later. So there's going to be 3 different things I'll talk about simultaneously. Actually, I can talk about 4 as well. PCO, carbon, oxy, and Hvac. I can talk about all those in one breath if I'm generic. Different manufacturers use different versions of these things, but I can pretty much talk about them all simultaneously from a generic standpoint. They have ones that mount through the duct, meaning these blue boxes or whatever color they are sticking outside the duct. And then they have ones with magnets that mount inside the system. So if you have an outdoor air handler, this is probably the way to go, right? Because I don't want to cut anything through the outside of it, right? If I have an indoor air handler or a duct system, I might go with one of these ones on top. All right, so the first technology we'll talk about PCO and carbon simultaneously because a lot of products will use both of them simultaneously. So PCO stands for photo catalytic oxidation. That will be on the test. Photo means light. There's a light source involved. So my UV light is that part. He's the photo part. His job in life is not to kill germs. His job is to be a catalyst. And if you flash back to high school chemistry, a catalyst is something that causes a chemical reaction. That's his job. The light is going to cause a chemical reaction. In this case, he's going to react with titanium dioxide that we put on the system or on the product or on the cage of the bulb to create oxidizers. That's really what I want the outcome to be. I want oxidizers that are available to me, which I will explain. So it's got the UV light, so if the bulb happens to be near the coil, it will have that benefit of helping keep the coil clean a little bit. This particular one I'm showing on top, it's not zoomed in very well, but this guy's doing three things in one. It has PCO on the top, carbon on the sides, and then the bottom of the cage is open so the UV bulb can shine down on the coil in this case. But they're not all like that. Some of them will have carbon on every side. Some of them will have titanium dioxide for PCO on every side. But this one happens to be doing multiple jobs here. UV bulb, we already talked about that in general, right? So as a killer of germs, right? So we understand how that works. The second part was that carbon. So if you have one of these devices, you'll typically have on there some black honeycomb looking type devices that airflow can go through. So those are on the left and right side of this particular widget. That bulb is going to be used to regenerate the carbon. I don't have to have the bulb there for the carbon. The carbon will absorb odors on its own, but it gets depleted, and having the bulb, the UV bulb shine on the carbon, regenerates the carbon. So I don't ever or seldomly have to replace those cartridges. So since I have a bulb anyway, might as well have it recharging the carbon. And the carbon does a good job of absorbing odors. Can't say the word. And that's a well-known thing. That's been around for decades and decades and decades. We've had carbon filters on air handling systems. I know one job where we have a hospital where the intake for the air handler is right next to the helipad. And 2-3 times a day, there's a helicopter sitting there for 10 minutes, spewing diesel fumes into the air, and the air handling system is sucking those in. So they put carbon filters in there to absorb the diesel fumes. It's a pretty well-established technology, unrelated to what we're talking about right now. That third component, so UV light is one component, carbon is sometimes another component, but that third one is the one we really want to talk about, the PCO, photocatalytic oxidation. So instead of a carbon cartridge on there, I'll have a white cartridge on there. Right, in this case, I have it white on the top. I could also have white on all four sides. It might be a round one. It might be a square one. Every manufacturer's got their own way of doing it. Some of them have a plate. But in any case, it's going to be white. The titanium dioxide is infused into that cartridge, and then the light is shining on that. That light causes a chemical reaction, which creates oxidizers, specifically in this case, hydroxyl radicals. Hydroxyl implies there's hydrogen and oxygen involved, right? The radical is the important part. Radical, if you flash back to high school chemistry again, radicals are unstable compounds. They are things that don't want to exist very long, right? So everything in the universe, if you want to think of it this way, wants to be in equilibrium. Things always go from high pressure to low pressure to balance out. High temp to low temp, right? In this case, I have things that are unstable. They want to break apart and reform as things that are more stable. Radicals don't last very long. And that's good, because as these radicals get generated by this device, they go down the duct system into the space, and now I have all these radicals, these oxidizers introduced into the space, and they're not stable, so they react with other things in the space and break them down. What kind of things do they react with? So in this case, we're showing just one of those oxidizers. We can produce more than one, usually 3, sometimes 4 different oxidizers are produced. My UV light is shining on the titanium dioxide. In this example, we're showing it creating OH. There's other ones. I'll show you those in a minute. And those guys do multiple things. They can break down chemicals, which we'll show you in a second. They can also surround germs, like they just clump onto stuff. Surround those because they're charged. They surround stuff. And the way to think of it is something like bacteria, for example. He needs to breathe hydrogen. He doesn't really breathe, right? But just think of it that way. So once he's surrounded by these oxidizers, he's essentially suffocated, or he's starved of the hydrogen he needs to survive, and then he will eventually die. So just like if you have your mouth covered, you don't get the oxygen you need. Germs, small things, need hydrogen, and we steal the hydrogen so they can't have it. Numerous manufacturers out there. We used to work with this vendor. We don't work with them anymore, but they have good data. A lot of manufacturers will test one bacteria, one virus, one mold, because these tests are pretty expensive, and then let that sort of imply they'll kill others. Some of them test more stuff because they got bigger budgets. Just depends. I mentioned Oxy-4. Most PCO devices create 3 oxidizers. I showed you them creating OH. They also create O2, and some of them create H2O2. All of those oxidizers work kind of in a similar fashion. Oxy-4, as the name implies, Oxy-4 creates a 4th oxidizer. In this case, it's O3. O3 is probably what you would refer to as ozone. Ozone is really good at killing stuff. Great. Some people don't want ozone in their space, right? Every entity has its own limit on how much ozone you can have in a space. The most restrictive, the most conservative is FDA, and they will allow up to 0.05 parts per million of ozone in a space before they say, okay, you have too much ozone. Most of these devices will produce between 0.02 and 0.04. Now, they can produce more or less. It depends on the size of the device you bought versus the size of the space you have and how much the space is ventilated. But if they're sized correctly, we'll be hovering around 0.02, 0.03, 0.04 parts per million, which is well below the FDA limit and certainly under the limit of other entities. But some people don't want any ozone. They want 0. That's totally fine. Those people, you don't put an Oxy-4 in. You don't give them the 4th oxidizer. You give them only 3. It's still the same titanium dioxide cage. The only difference is there's a different bulb. A PCO device uses a UVC bulb, and an Oxy-4 device uses a UVV bulb. So it's pretty similar, same plastic, same enclosure, same titanium, just a different device. Somebody typed a question in that I missed earlier, Stephen. Is carbon also known as a charcoal filter? Yes, charcoal is carbon-based, and charcoal can absorb a lot of stuff. I suppose if you ever you spilled gas on the floor of your garage, you could go grab your charcoal bag and dump it on there, and it'll absorb all the gas fumes. Now, you'd have a whole bunch of black crap all over your garage, so that wouldn't be a good idea, but it would do that kind of thing. So there's all kinds of versions of these, smaller and larger ones for different size applications. Sometimes you'll put in larger ones for a larger air handler. Sometimes you put 2 or 3 of these things in for even larger air handlers. At some point, it becomes impractical for like 100,000 CFM air handler. You're not going to put 12 of these in. You're going to find a different way to do something, and we'll talk about that. But for normal stuff, 10, 20, 30-ton systems, this is a pretty good way to do it. One of the issues we have come up with, at least in my office, is we made cheat sheets for all of the engineers and sales guys and everything. Hey, if you got this CFM system, you should put in this size Oxy-4 device, and then you're going to have the right amount for the right system, right? And you won't have too much ozone being produced to go over the limit. And then in practice, we hear about the job, like people are smelling the ozone, they're complaining about it. First of all, I don't know why they complain about the smell of the ozone. I like it. It's the same smell you smell on a rainy day. That's literally ozone being naturally created by the rain falling through the air. It's creating O3, which is ozone, right? If you go to the dentist office, right, and you sit down in the chair and they open up that package of those sterile tools, and you get that little poof of smell, and right, that metallic type smell. That's ozone. I like that smell, but other people don't like it, or they may be concerned that they have ozone in general. And this has happened because people use our cheat sheet charts, which are made for constant volume systems, meaning they always provide, say, 10,000 CFM, and they use the same chart on a VAV system. A VAV system, if you don't know, varies the air volume with the VFD. So you seldom ever have the peak design airflow. You're always at some partial condition, 30, 40, 50% of the airflow. So all of a sudden, these things are way oversized, and you got to unplug half of them. So if you're doing a VAV system, you need to take that into account. Don't design it for the worst case day, because the worst case day probably is never going to happen. And if it does, it only happens 5 times a year. So what? Design it for something more towards the middle, 40, 50, 60% of the airflow. All right, let's keep moving. I'm going to skip some of these installed ones in the interest of time, just to keep things going along. Some of these manufacturers have done testing on SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19. Some have not done that yet. Some have done testing on coronaviruses in general, but not that specific one. So just pay attention to that. My belief would be that if I can kill one type of coronavirus with this kind of device, I could probably kill them all, but I probably can't say that legally. So if you want to tell someone, i.e. the end user customer, that we're definitely going to be killing SARS-CoV-2, make sure you pick a product that actually has data that shows it kills SARS-CoV-2. Otherwise, don't say it, right? That kind of thing. This particular manufacturer, Respicare, was probably the second vendor that we had to come out with some data for killing this. And they have a pretty good kill rate. This is just kind of the marketing piece, but it was 99% kill rate in just a couple seconds, which is fantastic. Other than COVID, there's obviously tons of applications for this kind of stuff. Anywhere there's a lot of people, anywhere there's a lot of people that are immune compromised, so like nursing homes are great applications for this kind of stuff. Places where kids are touching and licking everything, right? Daycares and preschools and stuff like that. So there's lots of applications beyond just virus killing that you might want to do stuff. Gyms have always been great applications for this kind of stuff. You're supposed to go grab that bottle and the towel thing, right, and spray down the workbench after you're done with it. Not everybody does that, right? Having this thing creating oxidizers in the air, it doesn't just kill stuff in the air, by the way. It lands on counters and doorknobs and weights and workout benches and barbells and kill stuff on there. Should we still tell everyone to wipe everything down? Yeah, we absolutely should, right? But it doesn't hurt to have the air saturated with these oxidizers as well. Another way you can do that is with ionizers. Specifically, we're going to use bipolar ionizers. There's lots of manufacturers of these. These have been around for decades as well. They have found new favor in the industry because of this technology, because people have this stuff. And some customers don't want to change bulbs because they don't want to buy a new bulb every couple of years, or they don't even want to think about where the bulbs are even located or remember to do it, or whatever the reason is. They don't want to deal with any maintenance. The bipolar ionization industry has rebirthed. In fact, here it's just astronomical, like 5 to 10 times the sales volume that they had prior to COVID, right? Because there's low to no maintenance on these things. So the way these things work, I'm showing you two simple residential ones, then I'll show you some commercial ones in a minute. Bipolar ionization means there's going to be two. Bi means two. So I have one needle here. It's got a carbon brush on the end. Another needle there. One is charging things positive. One is charging things negative. And we're doing that way on purpose, kind of like some of those filters we talked about. So let's just say everything coming this way is positive. All the airflow going that way is negative. And if I have things that are positive, things that are negative, they are going to attract to each other. And then they're going to become bigger. They're going to collide, which is going to destroy some of the things, break them apart into smaller organisms. Or they're going to collide and stick together, one or the other. So colliding and sticking together is good because now they're bigger and I can vacuum them, sweep them, catch them in filters more easily. Colliding and busting apart is good too because if it's some kind of chemical or something and I can break it apart, great. Now what's the likelihood that it reforms as a bad chemical? Much lower. When you install these, you just have to pay attention. Not that you guys necessarily be the ones installing stuff, but you have to pay attention. You have to have the airflow going this way. You cannot have the airflow going this way because then I would charge him, say, positive, and then everybody coming by would be charged negative, and I end up with all negatives. Like I need half charged one way and half charged the other way. These ions that it's creating, so we got a question let me go back to. Isn't ozone an IAQ problem on its own because it outcompetes oxygen to be absorbed into the blood? Yes, ozone in large quantities is in fact a problem. Ozone is a great oxidizer and a great cleaner. But if you send a lot of ozone into the space and it doesn't have other stuff to react with because your space is super clean anyway, then yeah, it could become a problem. Like I said, FDA is the most restrictive with 0.05 parts per million. Other entities have higher limits, but let's just go with the most conservative to be safe. 0.05 is where the FDA says, okay, it's a safe amount. There's ozone in your air right now. You're breathing ozone all the time. There's always O3 around. When you have waterfalls, ozone is created. When you have rain going through the air, ozone is created. Right? There's always ozone being created. Electrical devices. If you have a plasma TV, ozone is being created. But I just don't want a lot of ozone, right? At least not a lot of ozone that I can use. So what I don't want to do is take there's actually ozone devices, right? So the devices I was talking about have a ozone byproduct associated with them, a small amount of ozone. There's other devices that are ozone cleaners. Typically, these are on wheels and have a fan on them, and you roll them in, and let's say your basement got flooded. Great, we cleaned everything up, we threw the carpet out, we threw the drywall away. We might put a couple of ozone cleaners in the basement and let them crank away for like 3-4 days, just killing everything down there. That's a temporary thing. I'm going to have a lot of ozone. I know that. I know it's not great for you long term, but I don't want it long term. I want it just for like 3 days to kill all the stuff that grew in my wall that I didn't know was growing behind there with my basement leak, right? Long term, I want no ozone or small amounts of ozone. The newest version of Ashrae standard 62.1, which would be the 2019 version. Is that right? Yeah. It says that all air cleaners need to be UL 2898 listed. And if you go read UL 2998, the big function of that is zero, goose egg, zero ozone production. So going forward, your codes eventually Ashrae makes its way into mechanical code. Mechanical makes its way into municipal code. So eventually your codes are going to require you to have UL 2998 listed air purifiers. Well, it's not going to require you to have the air purifier, but if you have one, it'll have to be 2998 listed, which means it'll have to be no ozone. So the ozone producing oxidizer devices, we can't do, right? So this guy would be off the table, but these guys would still be fair game. You can still do those PCO type devices, just not the Oxy 4 version, right? All right, so back off the oxidizers, back onto the ions. So we're producing these ions. They're going out into the space as well. Ionization is not new. This is super old stuff, used for numerous different reasons. But Ashrae has been having articles and information on it for literally decades, well before I was born. So old stuff, but having a new life, if you will, as air purification technology. So we're going to create these ions that are going to go out into the space. These ions, very similar to those oxidizers we talked about, are going to attach to and break down various pollutants, chemicals, microbials, things like that. From a chemical standpoint, any chemical that has an electron voltage of 12 and lower, we'll be able to break down with ions. Anything with 12 or higher, we cannot break down. So we can't break down oxygen, we can't break down methane in this particular chart. In fact, we don't want to, because we broke down oxygen and split it apart into two O's. And I did that with a bunch of these guys, right? A bunch of oxygen. Oxygen is O2, right? That's the oxygen you're breathing. And we bust that apart, I'd have a bunch of little single O's running around. Well, what might happen is 3 of them might buddy up, and the other 3 might buddy up. Well, what I have then? I would have ozone again. I'm not trying to produce ozone. It's kind of like not my goal. So anything above 12, it can't break down. So there's no ozone production with ionizers, 0. And that's another reason why they become more popular, is because people are trying to get non-ozone things, because that's the new recommendation from Ashrae. So that's kind of what they want. Stuff that's less than 12 electron volts, we can break down. And I'll give you an example. We'll take ammonia. That's the one I happen to have in a little pretty graphic here. So ammonia, if you didn't know, it is 3 parts hydrogen, 1 part nitrogen. Ammonia is not great to breathe. We can use it to clean and stuff like that, but we really don't want to be breathing it in, at least not in large quantities. So if it goes through this ion plasma field that I created, it'll bust it apart. It'll slam all these things around. It'll bust them apart. They could regroup again as ammonia. That's possible. Those 3 hydrogens and that 1 nitrogen could buddy up and become ammonia again. But it's not very likely. It's more likely those hydrogens floating around will jump on a single oxygen. Now I have an H2O. That sounds benign. And the 2 nitrogens might group together and become N2. That's the same nitrogen that I have in my atmosphere, N2. It's like, I don't know, like 80% of the air is nitrogen. So most of these things, when I bust apart these complex chemicals, if you look at it, they're made of pretty normal things. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, etc. So when I bust them apart, they're probably not going to reform as this complex thing. They'll probably reform as a non-complex thing, which is probably pretty safe. So usually the byproduct of ionization is having water vapor and nitrogen, and that's pretty non-objectionable for most people, right? Well, for all people. People like to have oxygen, obviously. The other thing that we can do with these things is, because they have a charge associated with them, we'll end up having these ion clusters, and just like the oxidizers, they will surround stuff and deprive those things of their nitrogen, right? These ions are also hydroxyls, just like the oxidizers were. They're natural detergents. So they're going to clump around stuff and just naturally cling together, and because they're positive and negatives, and that's going to starve off bacteria and viruses from getting the hydrogen that they need to survive. All right. We talked before about, if I take 2 Merv 8 filters and add them together, do I get a Merv 16? No, you don't. You still get Merv 18. And I mentioned there's ways to make your Merv filter behave better, right, and get more cumulative effect, right? So here's some Merv filters and how they do on their own with SARS. This is the old SARS, if you will, not SARS-CoV-2, because we didn't have any data on that. So I'm leading you to believe that something similar would happen with COVID, but I don't have any proof of that. So I'm just going to keep it generic with the SARS right now. And this data is from, well, it's a combination of data from Ashrae and from EPA.
But how much of those things, which are pretty similar in size to the other SARS-CoV-2 that we're concerned with. So let's say I had Mirv 10, I'm catching 12% of them. If I had Mirv 13, I'm catching 46%, right? Mirv 16, 76%. If I go to HEPA, I'm getting 99.9% of these small things. So the higher my Merv rating, the more of these small things I'm going to collect, which is why the Ashrae recommendation was a minimum of Mirv 14, although they had the note on there, use Mirv 13 if you can't handle the pressure drop of Mirv 14 to start catching coronaviruses, including SARS-CoV-2. If I combine those things with a UV bulb on my coil, which, as we mentioned, is going to have some killing effect on these viruses, right? I led you to believe that it's not going to do a great job, because what are the chances of them all coming back there 3, 4, 5 times? But it's still going to do something, right? So in this case, my Mirv 10 filter was catching 12% of this. If I had a Mirv 10 filter and combined with a UV light, I'd be neutralizing 35% of those germs, right? If I go up to like a Mirv 13 and a UV light, I'm getting 84%. So I'm doing pretty good with the UV light. It's I don't know, it's knocking out a third or half of those germs, right? It's doing something, right? Just like the filter's doing something. But I'd be much better off going with a HEPA, right? If I combine one of these filters with, instead of a UV light, I combine it with an ionizer, that Mirv 10 jumps from 12 to 89% effective. The Mirv 13 goes from 46 to 98.8. I don't know about you, but 98.8 is pretty much everything. Is it 99.9 like the HEPA? No, but it's pretty damn good. I would take a Mirv 13 with an ionizer at 98.8 and say it's, for my purposes as a building operator and a homeowner, it's almost as good as a HEPA at 99.9. It's pretty much there as far as the grand schemes of horseshoes and hand grenades here. But the nice thing is a Mirv 13 does not have very much pressure drop. The ionizer is going to make the filter work better because, once again, positive and negative attract. It makes things bigger. And once they're bigger, they're more likely to get stuck in the airflow. They're more likely, once they get back to the filter, to actually getting stuck. So because I have lots of small things clumped together, they look like big things. So it's a way for my filter that can only catch big things to actually start catching some small things. In addition to Ashrae and EPA, there's other folks that had some similar studies out there. These two labs, I don't know anything about those two labs. I just literally stole this slide from one of the Ashrae guys because he referenced those two labs having tests. But they had a Merv 18 with a bipolar ionizer behaving like a Merv 13. A Merv 12 with a bipolar ionizer, and this other labs test behaved like a Merv 16. So you can essentially get a higher functional Merv rating out of your existing filter by combining it with a bipolar ionizer. I'm going to skip these. This is just some slides I had in here for one specific manufacturer. Just know there's lots of configurations and widgets and places you can shove this stuff into to make it happen. Those needles on these guys need to be cleaned every couple months, just basically wiped off. Some of the manufacturers, like this one here, have put little, I'm going to call them helicopters on there, with a little tiny servo motor, and once a day that thing just spins, click, click, and basically knocks off debris off the tip of those bristles. So it's self-cleaning, if you will. So the negative is you have a moving part, which means, 10, 12, 15 years from now, you might have to change it out. The positive is I don't have to go to this device every month and manually knock debris off the brushes. Because once those things are charging, right, positive and negative, which means other things in the air might be sticking to them. So when you go look at these ones, we didn't used to have the helicopters. It used to just be plain needles sticking there, like the first drawing I showed you. Before the helicopters, we used to have to go brush them off because there'd be a bunch of dust and stuff that collected on there. And once that happens, they can't spark off and do it again. So you constantly have to clean them. Well, this thing cleans them every day. We're good to go. Right? And lots of different configurations are like that. This is GPS. iWave does the same thing. There's other ones out there too. Some of them make little skinny ones, like this is little ionizers, each one of those little pieces of this ribbon, and you can shove them inside like a P-tack at a hotel or a ductless mini split. Some of the manufacturers have these large giant ones that you can put into large air handlers. Basically, this manufacturer has like a main one, and then it has extensions in 6-inch increments. We used to have to get the dimensions of the air handler and then custom build a probe that went all the way across. We didn't build it, the manufacturer did. But now you just figure out how much length you have, and then you just take them off the shelf, and they click together like little Legos, basically. This manufacturer, GPS, they were the very first manufacturer we had that had any test data for SARS-CoV-2 specifically. Their data came out in June. Their testing was complete in June, which is like, I was still like flinching trying to figure out what was going on in June. They were done. Most of the other manufacturers couldn't even get their hands on the virus to test it at that point. It wasn't available to most labs yet, but they got their hands on it. Actually, they didn't. Their aviation division had got it because the airlines put in a lot of money to try to figure out ways to get some airplanes back up in the air, like with lots amount of people. So their aviation division got this stuff, and then they said, hey, you know what? Can we just throw a couple more devices in there? Can we throw a couple of our HVAC things into this test just to get the data? So they were able to get the data quickly. Since then, there's a couple manufacturers that have also done it, like the Respicare guys I showed you a minute ago. Right? So in 30 minutes time, they have a 99.9% kill rate with their device that produces 27,000 ions. And they have other ones. I didn't show you the ions, but they have other ones that produce way more ions than that. 300 million ions produced with that device. Right? So they have lots of production there. You can kill lots of stuff really quick. I mentioned UL 2998. And that is the new certification available for air cleaners to verify that they don't have any ozone production. Actually, to verify they have 5 parts per billion or less, which is a pretty small number. So there could still be like a little teeny tiny bit, but way less than any other electronics in your life produce. So basically, it's statistically 0. All right, and that's required by Ashrae 62.1 2019, like I had mentioned. Coming soon to mechanical code near you. All right, I'm going to keep plowing through. We only got like 9 minutes left. There's lots of applications that use bipolar ionizers. This is not new. It's not novel. It's just exciting again. White House has it. A bunch of universities do it. It's a pretty common thing. Airplanes do it. Not all, but many. Google does it, and they've been doing it before COVID, right? They've had this for years. Lots of manufacturers make it. I'm going to skip all these manufacturer things. There's lots of test data from every manufacturer. Has something like this. Whatever manufacturer you choose, ask them for their third-party test data. They should be able to give you test data for various germs, showing you what reduction they have of the germ and who tested it, right? It's going to be like Kansas State University, MC Science. There'd be different labs that are testing this stuff, but somebody other than them needs to be testing it and have that data available to you. Concordia University looks like they have a lab testing stuff, right? Somebody reliable, hospital, university, research center, etc. I'm going to skip all those. All right, last few things here I want to touch on. A couple of these will be just really quick hitters. If you have combustion appliances, it wouldn't be the worst idea to have carbon monoxide detectors in the building. We have them in residential, or at least you should have them in residential. Residential, if you didn't know, you should have a smoke detector inside every bedroom of your home. You should have a smoke detector and a carbon monoxide detector on every floor of your home. You should have a carbon monoxide detector in the furnace room. Most codes require it. Just because your house is old doesn't mean you shouldn't try to get it up to safety code, especially with easy things like carbon monoxide detectors if you have combustion appliances like furnaces and water heaters. Smoke detectors, commercially, some buildings will require them all throughout the ceiling. But then in addition to that, HVAC systems also require smoke detectors. If you have 2,000 CFM and larger, you're required by code to have a duct smoke detector. It's required by both the International Mechanical Code, which most states adopt, or municipalities. In the case of Massachusetts, where many of you are following IMC 2015. It requires duct smoke detectors for all systems 2,000 CFM and larger. NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, also requires it at 2,000 CFM. One of those requires it on the supply, one on the return. I don't remember which is which. If you're in a town that's following both IMC and NFPA, you'd have to put a detector on both the supply and the return. And then both of those codes, IMC and NFPA, at 15,000 CFM, always require a detector on both the supply and the return. The idea there is that if there's a fire in the building, the duct smoke detector will sense that smoke and shut down the system. There's no reason to use your fan and your duct system as a smoke distribution system to make sure everybody in the building gets smoke. We don't want to do that. So we just kill it all, shut it all down. Brian asks, in your opinion, is BPI, bipolar ionization, better than UV? Better to use both? I would use BPI. Reason being, my belief and my own experience is that the UV light is really only going to kill stuff that can shine on a long time. So it's really only good for killing stuff on the coil, not so much killing stuff in the air. Whereas the BPI, if I put it upstream of the coil, it'll kill stuff on the coil and stuff in the duct and stuff in the room. So I would use BPI if I'm going to buy one of those two things. Plus, you don't have to change the bulb. You could probably make a discussion on what's better, BPI or PCO, which is bulb-based, because those oxidizers are pretty potent for PCO. and they probably can kill more stuff than BPI can. But I can just keep sizing the BPI bigger and bigger. There's no limit on that. There's no limit to the maximum amount of ions that can go into space. Your body doesn't have any restrictions on that like we do with ozone. Okay, we'll keep on moving here. Other things. If you have spaces that are doing stuff, I mentioned carbon monoxide, right? Boiler rooms, stuff like that. If you got swimming pools, chlorine sensors, parking garages, NO2 for the diesel vehicles, loading docks. If you have a chiller room, refrigerant leak, there's all kinds of things. If you have something in a specific area of your building that is producing a gas, you should have a sensor that senses that gas. And if sensed in too high of a quantity, we turn on extra ventilation systems. We sound buzzers. We turn strobes on. There's a whole hour discussion we can have on each one of those gases. But just know that that's existent out there. We talked about ventilation and for dilution, and that brings us to the last thing we need to squeeze in the last 4 minutes here, which is humidity control. Both humidification and dehumidification. We do a bad job, residentially we do a good job at humidifying homes and a bad job dehumidifying. Commercially we do a bad job at both. So if you haven't seen this chart, it's called the Stirling chart. It's been around since 1985. You will see newer versions of it. It's just prettier graphics. It's all the same thing. Because there's no units on here, the graph pretty much lives forever, right? But the summary of it is down at the bottom. I have relative humidity. Bad things happen when it's dry. Different bad things happen when it's humid. Keep things in the middle, less bad things happen. That's literally the moral of the story here. Keep stuff between, say, 30 and 60%, or some people will say between 40 and 60%, and you'll have the least amount of bad things happening. You definitely don't want to get above 60% because then mold starts coming into play, fungus. Somebody told me, I don't know if it's true or not, but at 70% humidity, they said it takes about 2 weeks to grow mold. At 80% humidity, it takes like 3 days. Keep things under 60%, less bad things happen. 2 different Ashrae standards reference maximums for humidity. I forget which one says which, but Ashrae 62.1, which I already told you is the indoor air quality standard, and Ashrae standard 55, which is human thermal comfort, both have limits for maximum amount of moisture. I forget which is which, but one of them says 65%, one of them says 60%, and the reason I keep forgetting which one is which is because I honestly don't care. If one says the max is 65 and the other one says the max is 60, I just roll with the lower one and then I'm covered for both. So I will just tell everybody your maximum indoor humidity should never be above 60%. If it is, bad stuff's happening. Well, most of the buildings I go to, and by most I mean more than 90-some% of them, have days where it's more than 60% humidity in the space, and that's a problem. It's really easy to solve. There's lots of ways to get the humidity lower, and you do not need to buy a special dehumidifier for most jobs. Now, if it's a fitness center, okay, we need special equipment. But for like an office or school, we don't. The ways to do it are smaller equipment. Stop oversizing things. Everything is oversized, literally. I told you I can give you a 1-hour discussion on oversizing. It's a big problem. Everything gets oversized because every designer is deathly afraid that it's going to be 107 degrees and they won't be able to keep up. It's crazy. You need smaller equipment so it runs longer, so the evaporator stays wet longer, so we dehumidify more. It's very basic. I need lower airflow, less airflow. The lower the CFM, within a range of discussion here, the changes the sensible heat ratio, I can remove more moisture. Right? I might get bigger evaporator coils, with more fins per inch or more rows of depth. I might do that. I might put in sensors that babysit humidity or thermostats that have a humidity sensor and force the cooling on to dehumidify as well. And there's a few other things we can do. That's a whole nother discussion. I'm going to skip this one because this is a confusing chart. I'm just going to show you one chart instead. That one's for flu. What's going on here? Oh, there we go. I'm going to show you these ones instead. These ones are for coronaviruses, not SARS-CoV-2 specifically, because that data was not available yet, just regular coronaviruses. It's weird that I have to even say that. But the other 6 coronaviruses were following this pattern, so I would think that the newest one would follow this pattern too. And since this chart was made, I've heard other people mention the same thing on various webinars from the universities and stuff. But in any case, this is showing you how many days a typical virus would survive. This is 100% of the virus surviving. This is 10% surviving, only 1% surviving, only 0.1% survival. If I have humidity that's low, 20%, it survives like a week or two, a long time. I get a lot of these guys surviving. To get 90% of them killed naturally on their own, they got to basically sit there for 2 weeks. If it's too humid, in this case 80%, it's a similar story. It's a little better than being too dry. Too dry is worse than too humid, but it's still not very good, right? And then if I can get it towards the middle, in this case 50%, or what I told you before, 40 to 60%, keep it in the middle, the survival rate of the viruses in the space is much shorter. Now, if I just do humidity only, okay, that's great. But if I combine that with good air changes per hour, good filtration, bipolar ionizers, oxidizers, something else, then I'm doing really good. This one here, I got to put the Fahrenheit on here because I can't stand Celsius. Back in college, we did everything in Celsius. And I got to the real world, and people were like, what the hell are you talking about, bro? It's all Fahrenheit. I was like, damn it. I don't know what you guys are talking about either. So eventually now, after 30 years, I've converted my brain, but it's too late. So in any case, normal indoor temperature, we're going to only look at the blue line because that's at 68 degrees. That's a pretty common indoor temperature, maybe 68, 71, something like that. Pretty normal indoor temperature, at least as far as this chart goes. We're not at 100 degrees. We're not at 40 degrees. And over here on the left again, 100%, 10, not 1% survival, meaning 99% of the virus is gone. And you can see if my humidity is between 40 and 60%, the orange area, that's going to give me the best opportunity to get rid of these viruses. If it's too cold in the space, nah, it's not doing me any favors. If it's too humid, everything on the right, everything on the left, not doing me any favors. I could cook them out of there with 100 degrees, but I don't really want to work in an office that's 100 degrees, so that sucks. I'm not doing that. So at a normal temperature, if I get that humidity in line, it's going to help me out a lot. Okay, what other questions does anybody have? I'm at 11:01, so I'm already 1 minute over, but I can hang out for a few minutes and answer any questions. A lot of people have typed in asking me if I could provide slides. I could definitely do that. Skip a few things here. Oh, let me just show you this real quick. I said I had a particle counter that I use a lot. And the reason I use this one is A, it's inexpensive. B, it talks to my phone. And C, I have a lot of other tools from CPS, so it just kind of makes it easy for me. This one is meant to go into a building or a home as a temporary thing, get some data, and make some recommendations. I've historically mainly used it for like temperature, humidity, and VOC counts in the space, and even CO2. But more recently, people have been asking about PM 2.5 and PM 10, and it also happens to measure both of those. So it measures those things. You can talk to it through Bluetooth on a phone app. You can even set it up to actually make recommendations for various pollutants. You can run like reports. You can email yourself a report, that kind of stuff. Versus the other ones that were just particle counters. The one I showed you before was a pretty high-end one that cost thousands of dollars, which is fine, and it's really accurate, and it does stuff smaller than 2.5, which is great if I'm doing like a hospital or something. But for your average office building, I don't need that. This 2.5 is fine. And this tool is hundreds of dollars compared to thousands of dollars, so that's why I use that one. And then you got all the reports and stuff like that. In any case, that's my email address. That's what I was trying to get to. If you wanted something specifically, like you want a copy, you want a copy of the recording or whatever, you wanted some of the slides, whatever, let me know and I'll try to hunt down stuff for you. I'll probably do that either over the weekend or on Monday because I have another class to teach this afternoon here. But that's my email if you need something. And I don't see any other questions typed in. 4 or 5 of you guys were very active asking all kinds of questions, which is great. Some of which I think I was able to answer pretty good. Some of them mediocre, but I love the questions. If you guys are joining us the next 2 weeks, that would also be great. The next 2 weeks, it's the same time, Fridays, from 9 to noon Eastern time, 8 to 11 Central, if you happen to be Central, like me. And the two days are covering the same topic spread over 2 days, and it is energy savings for package systems, meaning like rooftops and stuff like that. So we'll cover things in detail like economizers, variable speed fans, smart stats, all that kind of stuff we'll talk about, and we can chat on all that on all those kinds of things. After 3 hours, like the voice is just like a big blended blurb over here. All right. Alberto has something to say. And by the way, Alberto, you can unmute yourself whenever you want if you want to say anything. But he said to mention that for you guys that registered through UMass, through the Utility Association in Massachusetts, that he will be able to send you guys CEU certificates after training. I'll run a report for him showing that you attended. It tells me when you logged in and when you logged out. I'll run that report for him. And so if you signed up and you attended, great. He can send you guys out the certificate. If there's anything else you want to add, Alberto, yell at us. Either type it in or unmute. Alberto's fantastic, by the way. He organizes all these webinars, not just the ones I do, but all the ones that you guys have been doing lately. So it's worked out pretty well. I wish I could be there with you. I've been coming out there every year for almost a decade, I think, and it's been great getting to interact with people. And it's kind of weird talking to a camera, but hey, gotta do what we gotta do right now. So thank you guys. I'm gonna stop the recording, and if there's no other questions, I'm gonna shut it down.